The night before my wedding, I left my phone on the kitchen island of my fiancé's Lake Forest estate. It was a simple, careless mistake. I drove 30 minutes back from my downtown Chicago apartment just to retrieve it. I keyed in the security code at the side terrace door, expecting the sprawling house to be asleep. Instead, 10 minutes later, I was standing in the pitch-black hallway, listening to the man I loved explain to his mother how he had successfully forged my signature to steal 51% of my life's work. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled his entire empire piece by piece, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Linda Vengeance. Drop your age in the comments below. I want to know at what age you realize the people who claim to love you are often the ones holding the knife. At 31 years old, I was the CEO of Lewis Capital. I built my boutique acquisitions firm from a spare bedroom into a towering presence in the Illinois financial sector. I evaluated risks for a living. I read complex contracts line by line until my eyes burned. I knew how to spot a bad deal, a hidden clause, a desperate seller. I spent my days swimming with sharks and my nights building an impenetrable fortress around my assets. Yet, I failed to audit the man sleeping next to me. Preston Sterling was supposed to be my safe harbor. He came from old Chicago money, possessing a quiet charm that disarmed my usual defenses. He never seemed intimidated by my ambition. He brought me coffee during late-night board meetings. He rubbed my shoulders when the quarterly projections caused my neck to cramp. He played the role of the perfect supportive partner flawlessly. The chill of the November wind clung to my silk coat as I slipped quietly through the mudroom. The Sterling estate was quiet, save for the low hum of a vintage jazz record drifting from the mahogany study down the hall. The air smelled of expensive cedar and lemon polish. I unbuttoned my coat, ready to grab my phone from the marble counter and leave. But then Victoria spoke. Her voice carried that distinct, practiced drawl of old money. It sounded like ice clinking against fine crystal. Sharp, unyielding, and unforgiving. "You are certain the firm processed the addendum?" Victoria asked. I paused mid-step. My heels sank into the thick Persian rug, deadening my footsteps. My lead attorney handled my prenuptial agreement. It was an airtight document designed to protect my company in the event of a divorce. There was no addendum. I frowned, stepping closer to the cracked oak doors. Preston let out a low chuckle, the same warm, effortless laugh that had charmed me over oysters on our first date, the laugh that made me believe I had finally found an equal. "It is done, Mother," he said. The final signature page was swapped out at 3 this afternoon. Once she says I do tomorrow, 51% of Lewis Capital transfers directly into the Sterling Family Trust. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. The temperature in the hallway seemed to plunge, freezing the blood in my veins. I pressed my back against the cold, plastered wall, edging closer to the sliver of golden light spilling from the study. "She is paranoid, Preston," Victoria countered. "She reviews every legal document. If she requests a final copy in the morning, she will see the equity transfer clause before she puts on her dress." "She will not request it," Preston replied smoothly. "I used the deepfake audio software to authorize the final seal. I called her lead counsel, posing as her. The technology is flawless." He did not suspect a thing. Furthermore, I had her physical corporate seal copied weeks ago when she left her home safe, unlocked. The firm thinks she approved the final revision verbally and stamped it herself. The paperwork is locked in their physical vault until Monday morning. She will be my wife by then. I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle the ragged breath tearing at my throat. He had broken into my personal safe while I was sleeping down the hall. He had digitized my voice. This was not a last-minute greedy impulse. This was a calculated, premeditated corporate heist. The man who had kissed my forehead 3 hours ago, promising to protect me forever, was orchestrating a hostile takeover of my entire existence. "You played her beautifully," Victoria murmured. The sound of amber liquid pouring into a glass echoed through the crack in the door. "It is almost a shame. She is a bright girl. But self-made money is so brittle. She lacks the pedigree to understand how true wealth operates. Our family needs that liquidity to cover the federal margins. Once we have the controlling stake, the board will force her out by the end of the quarter. We can liquidate her secondary assets to handle the outstanding loans. A cold sweat broke out across my shoulder blades. The Sterling family was not rich. They were drowning. The charity galas, the imported cars, the sprawling estate, it was a hollow stage play. They were bankrupt, and I was the mark. I was their bailout. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the ribs. Every romantic gesture, every supportive comment about my business growth, every time he asked detailed questions about my quarterly margins, it was all reconnaissance. He was not admiring my success. He was appraising my worth. I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind frantically rewinding the last 2 years of my life. I thought about the late nights I spent building Lewis Capital, the missed holidays, the relentless stress, the sheer willpower it took for a young African-American woman to carve out a space in the ruthless Chicago financial sector. I had sacrificed my 20s to build an empire that Preston Sterling was planning to steal before lunch. I thought about the way he looked at me when I secured my first major acquisition. I had mistaken his predatory calculation for pride. He had spent months studying my habits, learning my routines, memorizing the combination to my home safe. He knew my attorneys, he knew my security protocols, and he used my own trust to bypass them all. A profound, blinding rage began to replace the initial shock. This was not just a betrayal of the heart. This was a violation of my intellect. They believed I was just another naive, new money bride, desperate for the validation of an old family name. They thought I would smile for the cameras, walk down the aisle, and hand over the keys to my kingdom without a fight. Victoria believed my self-made money was brittle. She was about to find out that a woman who builds her own fortune from the ground up knows exactly how to tear one down. I needed to leave. I needed to get to my car, drive to my Aunt Beatrice, and figure out how to stop the legal gears Preston had already set in motion. If I canceled the wedding without proving fraud, my own contract stipulated a $5 million penalty payout to him. He had trapped me. If I walked down the aisle, I lost my company. If I ran away, I lost $5 million. I needed proof of their crime. I needed evidence that would stand up in a Cook County courtroom. I took a slow, agonizing step backward, intending to retreat to the kitchen. My heel caught the thick edge of the rug. I shifted my weight to regain my balance, raising my left wrist to steady myself against the wall. The screen of my Apple Watch lit up in the dark. A small blue icon flashed on the digital face. In my rush to silence my steps, I had forgotten to turn off my device settings. The watch sought out the nearest paired network. It connected instantly to the estate's central Bluetooth system. Inside the study, the jazz record abruptly cut out. The sudden dead silence in the house was deafening. The ice stopped clinking. The murmurs ceased. The silence stretched tight as a piano wire, ready to snap. "Did you hear that?" Preston asked. His voice lost all its warmth, dropping into a flat, predatory register. "The Bluetooth just synced," Victoria said, her tone tightening. "Someone is in the house." The heavy leather of an armchair groaned as Preston stood up. I could hear the sharp thud of his Italian leather shoes hitting the hardwood floor. He was moving deliberately toward the study doors. The golden light from the room shifted as his shadow fell across the opening. Panic spiked in my chest, threatening to paralyze my legs. My mind raced, running through the terrifying permutations of what would happen if he opened that door and saw me standing there. The element of surprise would be gone. The legal upper hand would evaporate. I would be trapped in an isolated estate with two people who viewed my existence merely as a financial obstacle. His footsteps grew louder. He was 5 feet away, then 4. The brass handle of the oak door began to slowly turn. My thumb instinctively found the digital crown on the side of my smartwatch. I tapped the screen twice, activating the hidden voice memo application. The device vibrated softly against my wrist, indicating it was recording. I captured the heavy creak of the hinges and the distinct sound of Preston stepping out of the study. "Who is there?" His voice held no warmth. It was cold, calculating, the tone of a predator disturbed during a meal. I did not wait to see his face. I abandoned the shadows, pivoting toward the mudroom exit. The smooth soles of my designer heels slipped slightly against the polished marble floor, but I caught my balance. I threw my weight against the heavy wooden frame of the side terrace door, pushing it open and slipping out into the biting November air. I pulled the door shut behind me just as a sliver of golden light from the hallway spilled onto the stone patio. The frost on the manicured lawn soaked through my shoes. I did not care. I sprinted toward the gravel driveway where my Lexus sat under the sprawling shadows of ancient oak trees. Every snap of a twig beneath my feet sounded like a gunshot in the quiet suburban night. The damp, cold air stung my lungs with every ragged breath. I reached the car, pulling the handle and throwing my body into the driver's seat. I pressed the ignition button. The engine hummed to life with a quiet efficiency. I shifted into drive and hit the gas, keeping my headlights off. I navigated the long, winding driveway by moonlight, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. I did not flip the illumination on until I cleared the wrought iron gates of the estate, merging recklessly onto the empty local road. I watched the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a pair of headlights hunting me down. Merging onto Interstate 94 toward downtown Chicago, the initial adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, analytical clarity. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale. The tires hummed a steady rhythm against the asphalt. I replayed the conversation from the study, analyzing my legal exposure. Lewis Capital was not just a portfolio of assets. It was the manifestation of a promise I made to my late father. He spent 30 years sorting mail for the Postal Service, returning home with aching joints and ink-stained fingers. He taught me how to read corporate balance sheets at the kitchen table using outdated library books. He sacrificed his own comfort to ensure I could attend a top-tier business school. Surrendering his legacy to a family of aristocratic parasites who could not even balance their own ledger was a fate worse than death. The legal parameters of my prenuptial agreement looped in my mind like a tightening noose. I had insisted on the contract myself, a point of pride to protect my firm. Preston had played the reluctant romantic, claiming he did not care about the money, but signing it to make me comfortable. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. If I sent a text message right now declaring the wedding canceled without citing provable legal cause, the penalty clause triggered automatically. I would owe Preston $5 million for breach of promise and reputational damage. It was a standard high net worth clause designed to prevent frivolous cancellations. If I married him, the forged addendum Victoria described would activate, handing them 51% of my voting shares. They had placed me in a perfect legal checkmate. I needed undeniable proof of their crime to trigger the nullification by deceit clause. I needed evidence that would stand up in a Cook County courtroom. Tears threatened to blur my vision, but I blinked them away. There was no time for grief. Grief was a luxury for people who were not actively being hunted. I compartmentalized the shattered remains of my personal life, focusing entirely on survival. I was no longer a bride. I was a chief executive operating in hostile territory. The silence in the car shattered. My phone illuminated the dark cabin resting on the passenger seat. The screen flashed the name of my fiancé, along with a photograph of us smiling in a Napa Valley vineyard. My stomach turned at the sight of his manufactured smile. I let the device ring. The ringing ceased for a fraction of a second before starting again. He was testing the waters. He needed to know if I was awake, if I was the one lurking in his hallway. I stared at the glowing screen, refusing to answer. Then a small gray banner dropped down from the top edge of the display. Location services active. Your device location is currently being viewed by Preston Sterling. My blood ran cold as the notification materialized. A few weeks ago, he had suggested we link our digital calendars and location settings. He claimed it was for safety during my late-night commutes from the financial district. I had found the gesture protective, endearing even. Now the truth stripped away that illusion. It was a digital leash. He was sitting in his leather armchair, staring at a screen, watching a blue dot move down the interstate, determining my exact speed and trajectory. If I drove back to my downtown penthouse, he would meet me there. If I diverted to the local police precinct, he would know immediately. I had no hard evidence yet, just an incomplete audio recording on my wrist and a wild accusation against a prominent local family. I needed to sever the tether. I could not simply power the device down. A sudden loss of signal would confirm I was fleeing and trigger his countermeasures early. I needed him to think I was running blind and panicked in the wrong direction. A towering freight truck rumbled in the middle lane ahead of me, its silver trailer reflecting the ambient glow of the highway lamps. The bold lettering on the side indicated a logistics route heading straight to the Wisconsin border, away from the city. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The Lexus surged forward, the engine roaring as I closed the gap. I aligned my passenger side door with the rear axles of the rumbling trailer. The aerodynamic drag buffeted my car, shaking the steering column in my grip. I pressed the window control. Frigid November wind rushed into the cabin, whipping my hair across my eyes and drowning out the sound of the radio. I snatched the ringing phone from the leather seat. Preston was still calling, his face glowing against my palm. I measured the speed, the wind resistance, and the narrow gap between my vehicle and the open cargo bed of the adjacent flatbed section. With a sharp, practiced motion, I hurled the device out the window. The phone sailed through the dark air, a tiny, glowing rectangle tumbling over the asphalt. It cleared the metal railing and landed with a faint, indistinguishable clatter inside the truck bed. I watched the taillights of the freight hauler continue north, carrying my digital footprint away at 70 miles per hour. I rolled the window up, sealing the cabin in a heavy, suffocating silence. I took the next exit, looping back toward the labyrinth of the western suburbs. I was off the grid, unreachable, unseen. But the temporary relief fractured as a new logistical nightmare took hold. By discarding my device, I had severed my only line of communication. I had no access to my encrypted corporate contacts, no digital wallet, and no way to alert my security team. I had less than 7 hours to stop a hostile corporate hemorrhage. My only remaining resource was a brilliant retired appellate judge who lived 20 miles away, and she had no idea a war had just begun. The dark highway stretched ahead, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of the street lamps. My digital footprint was currently speeding north inside the cargo bed of a freight hauler, but a harsh realization pierced my temporary relief. Severing the tether was only a superficial victory. The forged addendum still existed on the secure servers of my compromised lead counsel. Running away would only delay the hostile takeover by a few hours. The digital ink was already drying, waiting to be filed the moment the municipal courts opened. I needed to scorch the earth before the sun rose. I gripped the leather steering wheel, shifting my foot from the brake to the accelerator. I took the next cloverleaf exit, looping my vehicle back toward the towering skyline of downtown Chicago. Inside the hidden console compartment of my Lexus, I kept a specialized USB drive. My cybersecurity director had designed the program for emergency corporate containment in the event of a severe data breach. I never imagined I would be deploying it against my own legal representation. Returning to the present moment inside that darkened 42nd floor office, the progress bar on my laptop hit 100%. The executable file had successfully corrupted the localized backups of the prenuptial agreement, erasing any trace of the forged signature. I pulled the warm metal drive from the port and snapped the screen shut. The night security guard had moved to the opposite wing of the building, his heavy footsteps fading into a distant echo. I slipped out from beneath the mahogany desk, navigating the familiar shadows of the law firm with practiced precision. I bypassed the main illuminated lobby, utilizing the freight elevator designated for maintenance staff. The descent felt like plummeting into an abyss, but my mind remained terrifyingly clear. I stepped out into the damp alleyway, pulling my silk coat tight against the November chill. The digital copies were eradicated, but the physical threat, the printed documents sitting in a vault, still remained. I needed a war room. I needed a strategist. I needed Aunt Beatrice. I drove west toward the affluent, quiet streets of Oak Park, leaving the concrete canyons of the financial district behind. The historic homes stood like silent sentinels under the canopy of barren oak trees. I pulled into the sweeping driveway of a Victorian brick estate, killing the headlights, before the car came to a full stop. Beatrice Lewis was a retired appellate judge. She possessed a formidable intellect, a razor-sharp wit, and an unwavering intolerance for fools. After my father passed away, she became my anchor, guiding me through the treacherous waters of corporate America with the unyielding discipline of a military general. I bypassed the front door, moving directly to the rear garden entrance, obscured by tall, ivy-covered trellises. I keyed in her personal access code. The deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. The interior smelled of aged paper and dried lavender. A single warm pendant light illuminated the expansive kitchen. Beatrice stood at the marble island, pouring boiling water into a glass French press. She wore a tailored silk robe, her silver hair pulled into an immaculate structural knot. She did not startle when I entered the room. Her dark, discerning eyes scanned my ruined designer dress, my disheveled hair, and the faint tremor in my hands. She did not offer a comforting embrace or a sympathetic sigh. She understood that pity was useless during a crisis. She simply pushed a heavy ceramic mug across the counter. "Drink this," she commanded. Her tone was a heavy anchor dropping into my turbulent panic. "Then tell me exactly who we are destroying tonight." The scalding bitter liquid burned my throat, grounding my scattered senses. We moved to the formal dining room, spreading my emergency contingency files across the polished mahogany table. I relayed every single detail of the conversation I had overheard in the Sterling estate. I explained the forged addendum, the deepfake voice authorization, and the 51% equity theft Preston planned to execute upon our marriage. I detailed the impossible legal trap closing in around me. If I canceled the wedding without irrefutable proof of a crime, I triggered the $5 million penalty clause designed to protect the Sterling family reputation. If I stood at the altar and said, "I do," I surrendered the empire I had spent my entire adult life building. Beatrice listened in absolute silence, her expression unreadable. When I finished speaking, she opened her encrypted judicial laptop. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with lethal efficiency. "The Sterlings are arrogant," she stated, her eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the screen. Arrogance always leaves a paper trail. "We do not just cancel this wedding, Delwyn. We trigger the nullification by deceit clause. To do that, we need to expose their hidden insolvency on a highly public stage. I still maintain access to several restricted federal databases from my time on the bench. Let us see exactly how much debt Victoria and Preston are hiding behind their country club memberships and imported cars." The silence of the house was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the keyboard. We were racing against an invisible clock. The sun would rise in less than 3 hours. The banks would open. The Sterling lawyers would file the physical paperwork holding my forged signature. My heart hammered against my ribs, a steady, relentless drumbeat of impending war. Beatrice hit the final search query. A loading wheel spun on the display, pulling restricted financial records from a secured government server. We watched the screen holding our collective breath, waiting for the definitive proof of their financial ruin to materialize. Before the results could populate the tranquil silence of the suburban night, shattered. A heavy fist pounded against the thick wood of the front door. The sound echoed through the hallway like a crack of thunder. The doorbell chimed in rapid, frantic succession, piercing the quiet sanctuary we had just established. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I glanced at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining room. It was 4:15 in the morning. Nobody visits an appellate judge unannounced before dawn. Preston had found me. The heavy fist pounded against the thick wood of the front door again. The sound echoed through the hallway like a crack of thunder, shattering the fragile sanctuary we had just established. The doorbell chimed in rapid, frantic succession. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I glanced at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining room. It was 4:15 in the morning. Nobody visits an appellate judge unannounced before dawn. Preston had found me. Beatrice did not flinch. She raised a single, manicured hand, signaling for total silence. Her dark eyes darted toward the hallway and then back to the glowing screen of her laptop where the restricted financial records were still compiling. She closed the lid with a soft, definitive click, plunging the dining room into deep shadow. "Move to the study," she instructed, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the unyielding weight of a courtroom gavel. "Do not turn on the lights. Do not touch your car keys. Make no sound." I backed away from the table, my breath catching in my throat. I slipped down the corridor and ducked into the private study, pulling the heavy mahogany doors shut until only a narrow sliver of space remained. The room smelled of aged parchment, cherry wood, and bitter espresso. It was a space designed for intense intellectual warfare, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing decades of Illinois legal statutes. I pressed my back against the cold leather of an armchair, my heart hammering a relentless, chaotic rhythm against my ribs. Through the narrow gap, I watched Beatrice prepare for the confrontation. She did not rush. She tightened the sash of her silk robe, smoothed her silver hair, and transformed her posture. The comforting aunt dissolved entirely, replaced by the formidable legal mind who had stared down hostile witnesses and corrupt politicians for 30 years. She walked toward the foyer with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator claiming its territory. Beatrice unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, leaving the security chain engaged. The frigid November wind swept into the house, rustling the dry leaves on the porch. Preston stood under the dim, amber glow of the porch light. He wore a tailored cashmere overcoat, but his usual immaculate presentation was fractured. His tie was loosened. His hair was slightly disheveled. He was breathing heavily, feigning the physical exertion of a desperate, terrified man. He pressed his hands against the doorframe, staring through the narrow opening with wide, frantic eyes. "Beatrice, I am so sorry to disturb you at this hour," he said, his voice trembling with manufactured panic. "Is Delwyn here? Please tell me she is here." Beatrice crossed her arms, maintaining a posture of bored irritation. "Preston, do you have any idea what time it is? She is not here. Why on earth would my niece be knocking on my door before sunrise on her wedding day?" He let out a ragged sigh, running a hand through his hair. "We cannot find her, Beatrice. She left my estate hours ago. We linked our devices a few weeks back for her safety. Her location signal showed her heading north on the interstate toward Wisconsin, but then the signal vanished entirely. I was terrified she had been run off the road. I deployed a private search firm to track her route." My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. I had thrown the device into the back of a freight hauler to create a ghost trail, hoping to buy myself at least 12 hours of invisibility. I had underestimated his resources. He did not just sit back and watch the dot disappear. He had mobilized an active tracking team the moment the signal dropped. They pulled the highway toll records. Preston continued, his tone dripping with desperate concern. Her vehicle transponder pinged an electronic toll booth heading back into the city limits an hour later. She did not go to Wisconsin. She looped back. I drove to her downtown penthouse, but her car was not in the garage. This was the only other place she could be. "Beatrice, please, you have to let me inside. I need to know she is safe." He pressed his weight against the heavy wood, attempting to widen the gap. The metal security chain pulled taut, groaning under the pressure. Beatrice did not step back. She stepped forward, closing the distance until she was inches from his face. "Remove your hand from my door," she commanded. Her voice was low, smooth, and colder than the November wind. Preston blinked, stepping back onto the welcome mat. The facade of the terrified fiancé slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the calculating hunter beneath. He adjusted his stance, dropping the trembling inflection from his voice. "You do not understand the severity of the situation, Beatrice. She has been under immense pressure recently. The final stages of the wedding planning, combined with the upcoming anniversary of her father's passing, have taken a severe toll on her. I have noticed a sharp decline in her emotional stability over the past few weeks. She has been paranoid, erratic. I am deeply concerned she is experiencing a severe psychological episode. She is a danger to herself. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against the sides of my head. The sheer, calculated cruelty of his strategy hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was not just looking for his missing bride. He was actively interviewing witnesses. He was standing on the porch of a retired appellate judge, planting seeds of doubt regarding my mental competence. He was laying the foundation for a medical narrative. If I attempted to cancel the massive corporate merger concealed within our prenuptial agreement, he would use these documented interactions to file an emergency petition for conservatorship. He would claim I was having a nervous breakdown, rendering me legally unfit to govern Lewis Capital. He would seize my company, not through marriage, but through medical proxy. Beatrice narrowed her eyes. Her expression remained an unreadable mask of mild annoyance. If she is experiencing a breakdown, Preston, the last thing she needs is you hunting her down in the dark like a fugitive. If she contacts me, I will ensure she receives appropriate care. Now, I suggest you return to your estate and wait for morning. He did not retreat. He leaned closer to the narrow opening, lowering his voice into a harsh, demanding register. She is my responsibility now, Beatrice. She belongs with me. I know you are hiding her. I can see her car parked behind the tall hedges at the edge of your driveway. The engine block is still ticking. The air in the hallway turned to ice. I had killed the headlights the moment I pulled onto the property, but in my blind panic, I had failed to park deep enough inside the garage structure. He had seen the Lexus. The lie was exposed. The careful barrier Beatrice had constructed was crumbling. Preston reached into his cashmere coat, pulling out his sleek, dark smartphone. He tapped the screen, unlocking the device. If you do not unchain this door, Beatrice, I will have no choice but to escalate this. I am calling the local precinct. I will request an immediate forced wellness check on this residence. I will inform them my erratic, missing fiancé is being held here against her will. The authorities will swarm this property before the sun comes up. He held the glowing screen up to the gap in the door, his thumb hovering over the dial icon. He was turning my ultimate safe haven into a trap. If the police arrived, they would document my disheveled state, my ruined silk dress, and my sheer terror. That police report would become the exact judicial evidence Preston needed to prove my psychological collapse. He was tightening the noose, and I had nowhere left to run. The heavy fist pounded against the thick wood of the front door again. The sound echoed through the hallway like a crack of thunder, shattering the fragile sanctuary we had just established. The doorbell chimed in rapid, frantic succession. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I glanced at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner of the dining room. It was 4:15 in the morning. Nobody visits an appellate judge unannounced before dawn. Preston had found me. Beatrice did not flinch. She raised a single, manicured hand, signaling for total silence. Her dark eyes darted toward the hallway and then back to the glowing screen of her laptop, where the restricted financial records were still compiling. She closed the lid with a soft, definitive click, plunging the dining room into deep shadow. "Move to the study," she instructed, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the unyielding weight of a courtroom gavel. "Do not turn on the lights. Do not touch your car keys. Make no sound." I backed away from the table, my breath catching in my throat. I slipped down the corridor and ducked into the private study, pulling the heavy mahogany doors shut until only a narrow sliver of space remained. The room smelled of aged parchment, cherry wood, and bitter espresso. It was a space designed for intense intellectual warfare, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing decades of Illinois legal statutes. I pressed my back against the cold leather of an armchair, my heart hammering a relentless, chaotic rhythm against my ribs. Through the narrow gap, I watched Beatrice prepare for the confrontation. She did not rush. She tightened the sash of her silk robe, smoothed her silver hair, and transformed her posture. The comforting aunt dissolved entirely, replaced by the formidable legal mind who had stared down hostile witnesses and corrupt politicians for 30 years. She walked toward the foyer with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator claiming its territory. Beatrice unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, leaving the security chain engaged. The frigid November wind swept into the house, rustling the dry leaves on the porch. Preston stood under the dim amber glow of the porch light. He wore a tailored cashmere overcoat, but his usual immaculate presentation was fractured. His tie was loosened. His hair was slightly disheveled. He was breathing heavily, feigning the physical exertion of a desperate, terrified man. He pressed his hands against the doorframe, staring through the narrow opening with wide, frantic eyes. "Beatrice, I am so sorry to disturb you at this hour," he said, his voice trembling with manufactured panic. "Is Delwyn here? Please tell me she is here." Beatrice crossed her arms, maintaining a posture of bored irritation. "Preston, do you have any idea what time it is? She is not here. Why on earth would my niece be knocking on my door before sunrise on her wedding day?" He let out a ragged sigh, running a hand through his hair. "We cannot find her, Beatrice. She left my estate hours ago. We linked our devices a few weeks back for her safety. Her location signal showed her heading north on the interstate toward Wisconsin, but then the signal vanished entirely. I was terrified she had been run off the road. I deployed a private search firm to track her route." He pressed his weight against the heavy wood, attempting to widen the gap. The metal security chain pulled taut, groaning under the pressure. Beatrice did not step back. She stepped forward, closing the distance until she was inches from his face. "Remove your hand from my door," she commanded. Her voice was low, smooth, and colder than the November wind. Preston blinked, stepping back onto the welcome mat. The facade of the terrified fiancé slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the calculating hunter beneath. He adjusted his stance, dropping the trembling inflection from his voice. "You do not understand the severity of the situation, Beatrice. She has been under immense pressure recently. The final stages of the wedding planning, combined with the upcoming anniversary of her father's passing, have taken a severe toll on her. I have noticed a sharp decline in her emotional stability over the past few weeks. She has been paranoid, erratic. I am deeply concerned she is experiencing a severe psychological episode. She is a danger to herself." He reached into his cashmere coat, pulling out his sleek, dark smartphone. He tapped the screen, unlocking the device. "If you do not unchain this door, Beatrice, I will have no choice but to escalate this. I am calling the local precinct. I will request an immediate forced wellness check on this residence. I will inform them my erratic, missing fiancé is being held here against her will." Beatrice stood motionless in the doorway. She stared at the glowing screen in his hand and then met his frantic gaze. A low, dry chuckle escaped her lips. It was a sound entirely devoid of humor. "Dial the number Preston," she said, her voice echoing with the authority of a packed courtroom. "Tell the dispatcher you wish to demand a forced entry into the private residence of an Illinois appellate judge based on a hunch about a parked car. I still play golf with the precinct captain. I will have you sitting in a holding cell for filing a false report before the sun crests over Lake Michigan." He hesitated. The thumb hovering over the screen twitched. He knew Beatrice was not bluffing. She wielded her legal connections like a sharpened blade. He lowered the device, slipping it back into his pocket. He nodded slowly, adopting a posture of resigned sorrow. "I am only trying to save her, Beatrice," he said, lowering his chin. "I fear what she might do to herself. That is why I already dispatched the Chicago Police Department to her downtown penthouse an hour ago. I requested a formal wellness check. They are documenting her absence and the disarray of her apartment as we speak. I had to create an official record. It is for her own protection when the medical evaluations begin." Standing in the shadows of the study, my lungs refused to expand. The sheer, terrifying scope of his strategy crystallized in my mind. A formal wellness check conducted by sworn officers would generate a police report detailing my sudden disappearance on the eve of my wedding. He would point to the stress of the corporate merger. He would highlight the grief I still carried from my father's passing. He would use that police report to petition a state judge for an emergency conservatorship. He intended to strip away my legal autonomy entirely. He wanted the courts to declare me unfit to manage Lewis Capital, granting him total control of my assets without ever needing to say I do. You are treading on very dangerous ground, Preston. Beatrice warned, her tone dropping into a lethal whisper. You mistake my patience for weakness. You have 10 seconds to step off my porch before I consider you a hostile trespasser and defend my property accordingly. He held her gaze for a long moment, measuring the iron resolve in her eyes. He realized he could not break her. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, retreating from the welcome mat onto the frost-covered walkway. Tell Delwyn I love her, he said, his voice dripping with venomous sincerity. Tell her I will see her at the altar. Beatrice slammed the heavy oak door, shutting the deadbolt with a resounding crack. I stepped out of the study, my legs trembling beneath the silk fabric of my ruined dress. We exchanged a look of mutual, terrifying understanding. The battle lines were no longer drawn in the shadows. The war was active. I moved swiftly toward the front window, slipping behind the heavy velvet drapes. I pressed my shoulder against the wall, peering through a narrow gap in the fabric. Preston walked briskly down the driveway toward his sleek black sedan. The posture of the defeated, frantic lover vanished the moment Beatrice closed the door. His stride was rigid, furious. He did not get into the driver's seat immediately. He pulled his smartphone from his coat pocket, lifting it to his ear. I strained to listen, holding my breath as the cold glass of the window pane seeped through my clothes. The quiet suburban street carried his voice through the crisp night air. Vanessa, pick up the phone. He snapped, his tone sharp and demanding. Vanessa was his older sister. She operated as the chief financial officer for the Sterling Family Trust. She possessed a mind as ruthless and bankrupt as her brother. She was the architect behind their desperate attempts to maintain their aristocratic facade while drowning in federal debt. We have a situation. Preston continued, pacing a tight circle near the rear bumper of his car. She dumped her tracking device somewhere on the interstate. I just hit a brick wall with the judge. She knows something is wrong, Vanessa. I can feel it. She is planning a countermeasure. A brief pause followed as the voice on the other end responded. Preston ran a hand over his face, his frustration palpable even from a distance. No, we cannot wait for the ceremony, he hissed. If she suspects the addendum, she will try to move the liquid assets before she walks down the aisle. You need to initiate the contingency protocol. Contact our inside man at the investment bank. I want a total lockdown on all Lewis Capital corporate accounts by 8 o'clock this morning. Freeze the routing numbers. Restrict all outgoing wire transfers. Claim there is a suspected security breach due to the wedding distraction. Just blindfold her financial team until the ink is dry on the marriage certificate. He ended the call, sliding into the leather interior of his sedan. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet morning. The taillights flared red as he sped away, leaving a trail of exhaust hanging in the freezing air. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing to process the catastrophic deadline he had just established. It was 4:30 in the morning. The financial institutions of Chicago opened their digital gates at 8. I had exactly 3.5 hours before Vanessa strangled my company from the inside out. Lewis Capital possessed millions in liquid capital, sitting in holding accounts meant for upcoming acquisitions. If Vanessa initiated a lockdown through their compromised contacts, I would be paralyzed. I could not pay my vendors, secure my employees, or maneuver my funds to protect the firm. They would trap my money in a frozen vault and use the forged prenuptial agreement to claim it as their own. Beatrice walked into the parlor, turning on a single low table lamp. She looked at my pale reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. He is moving to choke your liquidity, she stated, reading the panic etched across my face. He called Vanessa. I replied, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet room. He ordered her to freeze my corporate accounts by 8 o'clock. They are terrified I will move the money before the ceremony. Beatrice, if they lock those accounts, I lose all leverage. I cannot fight a legal war without capital. I will be drained dry before Monday morning. Then we move the capital first, she said, her tone crisp and pragmatic. We drain the accounts before they even wake up their banking contacts. We establish a blind trust. I nodded, pacing the length of the Persian rug. I can authorize an emergency transfer of all liquid assets. I can move the entire war chest into an encrypted offshore holding entity. It is a severe maneuver, but it will effectively drain the accounts Preston is trying to seize. When Vanessa attempts her lockdown, she will be freezing an empty box. Beatrice moved to her laptop, opening the screen. The restricted financial files she had downloaded earlier illuminated her face. Do it, Delwyn. Contact your chief financial officer right now. Wake him up. Give the order. I reached for the secure encrypted phone Beatrice kept in her desk drawer. I dialed the private number of my chief financial officer, listening to the dial tone ring through the silent house. But as I mentally rehearsed the authorization codes, a sickening realization brought my pacing to a sudden halt. The digital transfer protocols for Lewis Capital were designed to be impenetrable. To move a sum that large required dual authentication. I could initiate the wire transfer remotely, but the bank required a secondary biometric verification to release the funds. It was a physical security token, a small encrypted drive keyed specifically to my fingerprint. Without it, the transaction would bounce back, triggering an automatic internal audit. "Where is your token?" Beatrice asked, watching my face drain of color. I stared at the glowing screen of the laptop, the weight of the impending dawn crushing my chest. "I left it in my bridal bag." I whispered the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "It is zipped inside the inner pocket of my garment bag." Beatrice closed her eyes, taking a slow, measured breath. "And where is the bridal bag, Delwyn?" "It is at the Drake Hotel." I replied, my voice barely audible. "In the bridal suite. Victoria and Vanessa are already there, waiting for me to arrive for the morning preparations." The 3-hour countdown had begun. I had to secure my life savings, but the only key to my survival was sitting in a luxury suite, surrounded by the very people plotting my ruin. To save my empire, I had to walk straight into the lion's den, pretend I was a blushing bride, and smile at my enemies, while the clock ticked down to 0. The sky above Oak Park transitioned from a bruised purple to a pale, icy gray. The first rays of morning light filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of the dining room, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. I sat across from Beatrice, watching the loading wheel on her encrypted laptop finally vanish. A dense spreadsheet populated the screen. Rows of red numbers and restricted federal tax liens filled the display. "Look at this," Beatrice said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "It is worse than mere insolvency, Delwyn. The Sterling Family Trust is carrying $40 million in defaulted federal loans. The Internal Revenue Service has already initiated a silent audit. They are facing asset seizure and potential federal racketeering charges before the end of the fiscal year. Their real estate portfolio is a house of cards built on fraudulent appraisals and empty shell corporations." I leaned forward, scanning the columns of financial ruin, the puzzle pieces locked together forming a terrifying picture. Preston was not just trying to steal my company to fund his luxurious lifestyle. He was trying to buy his family out of federal prison. My liquid capital was the exact amount required to pacify their government creditors. They were cornered animals. Cornered creatures possess no moral boundaries. They would stop at nothing to secure my signature today. I picked up the encrypted phone from the desk, dialing the private number of my chief financial officer, Elias. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. Elias and I had spent the last 5 years turning Lewis Capital from a theoretical startup into a dominant force in the acquisitions market. He knew every vulnerability in our corporate architecture because we built the fortress together. We had spent countless late nights drafting defensive protocols to protect our assets from hostile competitors. I was about to trigger our most extreme countermeasure against my own groom. "Elias, wake up," I said, my tone sharp and urgent. "We have a Tier 1 corporate emergency. I need you to initiate the blind trust contingency protocol immediately." I heard the rustle of sheets and the heavy thud of his feet hitting the floor. "Delwyn, it is 5 a.m. on your wedding day. What are you talking about?" "The Sterling family is attempting a hostile takeover using a forged addendum to my prenuptial agreement," I explained. They plan to lock down our routing numbers by 8 o'clock this morning. We need to drain the holding accounts right now. Transfer the entire war chest into the offshore defensive trust. Leave them nothing but empty vaults to freeze. The sound of a laptop booting up echoed through the speaker. Elias typed rapidly, his breathing shallow. I am bypassing the primary firewalls now, he reported. I am setting up the routing parameters for the offshore transfer. The capital is staged and ready to move. But Delwyn, you know the architecture. I can stage the funds, but I cannot execute the release. The system requires your physical security token. I need the biometric clearance from your end to authorize a transfer of this magnitude. I know, I replied, staring at the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. The brass pendulum swung back and forth, a relentless reminder of the vanishing time. I left the token in my garment bag at the Drake Hotel. Then you need to get it. Elias warned, his voice tight with anxiety. The banking servers run their daily security sweep at 8:15. If Vanessa contacts her inside man at the investment bank before you authenticate the transfer, they will freeze the accounts. You have less than 3 hours. I ended the call, placing the phone gently on the polished wood table. The reality of my situation settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. To save my life work, I had to walk directly into the snare they had set. Victoria and Vanessa were already occupying the bridal suite, expecting a naive, unsuspecting bride to arrive for hair and makeup. I had to look them in the eyes, smile, and endure their suffocating presence while I hunted for a tiny metal drive hidden in my luggage. Beatrice stood up, closing her laptop. She walked over to the antique mirror hanging above the fireplace and gestured for me to look at my reflection. My silk dress was wrinkled and stained with damp earth from my sprint across the sterling lawn. My hair was disheveled. I looked like a woman who had spent the night running for her life. You cannot walk into the Drake Hotel looking like a victim, Beatrice stated. You must walk in looking like a conqueror. You must play the role they assigned you flawlessly. If you show a single fraction of fear or suspicion, they will realize the trap has failed. They will accelerate their timeline and physically prevent you from reaching your bags. I nodded, turning away from the mirror. I needed to wash the exhaustion from my face. I needed to change my clothes and construct an impenetrable psychological armor. Beatrice led me to her guest bedroom, retrieving a pristine white cashmere sweater and tailored slacks from her own wardrobe. The clothing was an elegant disguise. It projected the image of a calm, wealthy bride arriving for her special day. I stepped into the hot shower, letting the scalding water wash away the freezing chill of the November night. As the steam filled the room, I thought about the boardrooms I had conquered, the hostile negotiations I had navigated, and the men who had underestimated me because of my youth and my race. I had built a reputation for being unflappable. I had never let an opponent see me bleed. Today would be no different. I would take the acting skills I honed in corporate warfare and apply them to my own wedding day. I dressed quickly, twisting my hair into a sleek knot at the nape of my neck. I applied a layer of subtle makeup, masking the dark circles beneath my eyes. When I returned to the dining room, Beatrice handed me a fresh cup of coffee and the keys to her inconspicuous sedan. My Lexus was too recognizable and would raise unwanted questions if I arrived in it after Preston claimed I was missing. "Drive safely, Dylan," Beatrice said, her dark eyes holding a fierce, unwavering pride. "Remember your father taught you how to read the fine print. Today, you rewrite the entire contract." I took the keys, gripping them tight in my palm. The drive from Oak Park to the Magnificent Mile would take 30 minutes. The sun was fully above the horizon now, casting a brilliant golden light over the Chicago skyline. The city was waking up, entirely unaware of the silent war unfolding within its borders. I steered the car onto the Eisenhower Expressway, my mind rehearsing every smile, every greeting, and every lie I was about to tell. The towering, ornate facade of the Drake Hotel loomed into view, an elegant monument to luxury and old money. I handed the keys to the valet, stepping onto the bustling sidewalk. My chest tightened as I approached the revolving brass doors. High above me in the bridal suite, the architects of my ruin were drinking champagne and waiting for their pawn to arrive. I took a deep breath, forcing a radiant, joyful smile onto my face. I stepped into the grand lobby, ready to walk straight into the ambush. The plush carpet of the Drake Hotel hallway muffled my footsteps as I approached the double doors of the bridal suite. I paused, resting my hand on the brass handle. I arranged my features into a mask of serene bridal joy, burying the profound terror and rage beneath a flawless veneer. I pushed the doors open, stepping into a room flooded with bright morning sunlight and the overwhelming scent of white roses. Victoria and Vanessa sat on a velvet sofa, sipping mimosas. They froze when I entered, their eyes sweeping over my borrowed cashmere sweater and pristine slacks. They were searching for cracks. They were looking for the erratic, paranoid woman Preston had described just hours earlier. I gave them nothing but a radiant, unbothered smile. "Good morning," I said, my voice light and musical. I hope I did not keep anyone waiting too long. I took a long walk by the lake this morning to clear my head before the chaos begins. Victoria stood up, her silk robe pooling around her ankles. Her smile was tight, her eyes calculating. She stepped forward, pulling me into a rigid embrace. Her perfume smelled of expensive lilies and cold calculation. "Delwyn, darling, we were beginning to worry," she murmured, her fingers digging slightly into my shoulders. "Preston said you were unreachable last night. He was quite distressed." I let out a soft, practiced laugh, waving a hand dismissively. I turned my phone off and left it at the estate, by mistake. I needed a few hours of absolute silence before the biggest day of my life. "A bride needs her beauty rest, Victoria." Vanessa watched me from the sofa, her expression unreadable. As the chief financial officer of the Sterling Trust, Vanessa possessed a brilliant but corrupted mind. She had married a wealthy banking executive 5 years ago, a strategic alliance brokered by Victoria to secure a short-term credit line. Vanessa traded her autonomy for a seat at the head of the family table. She viewed me not as a sister, but as a fresh infusion of capital to keep her sinking ship afloat. She set her crystal flute down, the glass clinking sharply against the marble table. "Well, you are here now," Vanessa noted, her tone flat. "We should begin. The stylists have been waiting in the adjoining room." The next hour transformed the luxurious suite into a psychological prison. The hair and makeup team hovered around me, wielding brushes and hot irons, applying a layer of flawless perfection over my underlying dread. I watched Victoria through the vanity mirror. She did not sit back and relax. She paced the perimeter of the room, operating as a highly vigilant warden. Her gaze constantly tracked my movements, ensuring I remained firmly planted in the makeup chair. My physical security token, the singular device required to drain my corporate accounts and save my life work, was zipped inside a small leather pouch tucked into my hanging garment bag. The bag hung inside the walk-in closet, less than 20 feet away. Every time I shifted my weight or attempted to invent an excuse to stand up, Victoria materialized at my shoulder, offering another glass of water or instructing the stylist to fix a stray piece of hair. She was deliberately cutting off my access to my belongings, isolating me from the outside world. The digital clock on the bedside table read 8:10. I had 5 minutes before the municipal banks opened their digital gates. 5 minutes before Vanessa could contact her inside man and initiate the lockdown on my routing numbers. Panic fluttered in my throat, sharp and suffocating like crushed glass. I swallowed it down, maintaining a serene smile as the stylist applied a final coat of blush. "It is time for the dress," Victoria announced, dismissing the beauty team with a sharp wave of her hand. "We will help you into it, Delwyn." The stylists packed their kits and exited the suite, leaving me alone with my enemies. Vanessa unzipped the opaque protective cover, revealing the bridal gown. It was a custom creation of heavy imported silk and intricate lace, costing $15,000. Months ago, when I stood on a pedestal in the boutique, I viewed the dress as a profound symbol of my arrival. I believed it proved a young, self-made woman from the South Side could seamlessly integrate into the highest echelons of Chicago high society. Now, as I stepped into the heavy fabric, the symbolism twisted into something grotesque. The gown was not a romantic dream. It was a beautiful, expensive straitjacket. Vanessa stood behind me, pulling the corset laces tight. The rigid boning pressed into my ribs, restricting my lung capacity. I gasped softly, gripping the edge of the dressing screen. "Hold still, Delwyn," Vanessa commanded, her knuckles brushing against my bare spine as she yanked the silk cords tighter. "Beauty requires a little discomfort. You want everything to be perfectly secured, do you not?" Her words carried a heavy, venomous subtext. She was not talking about the dress. She was talking about my assets. The heavy silk skirt weighed down my legs, making it difficult to walk. I was physically constrained, wrapped in a suffocating armor designed to present me as a flawless, silent prize. I stared at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. I looked like a pristine porcelain doll, ready to be placed on a shelf and dismantled for parts. "I need a moment," I said, my voice breathless. "I need to get my emergency kit from my bag. I have a headache coming on." I took a step toward the walk-in closet. Victoria smoothly intercepted me, blocking the doorway with her body. "Nonsense, darling," she cooed, placing a cold hand against my cheek. "I have aspirin right here. Let us not wrinkle that exquisite silk by digging through luggage." She guided me back toward the center of the room, forcing me to sit on the edge of the velvet sofa. The clock read 8:14. My window of opportunity was rapidly closing. I needed a distraction. I needed a way to break her perimeter and reach the closet. Before I could formulate a strategy, Victoria walked over to an antique writing desk near the window. She picked up a sleek silver velvet box and a leather folio, returning to stand directly in front of me. Her smile widened, but it did not reach her eyes. "Preston wanted me to give you this before you walk down the aisle," Victoria said, opening the silver box. Inside, a thick, diamond collar necklace rested on a bed of black satin. The stones caught the morning sunlight, throwing fractured rainbows across the walls of the suite. It was a breathtaking piece of jewelry, a Sterling family heirloom that had been worn by generations of brides. It was also a glittering collar designed to mark their property. "It is beautiful," I murmured, forcing a tone of breathless awe. "It belongs to the estate," Victoria corrected smoothly. Which brings us to a small piece of tedious paperwork. She opened the leather folio, presenting a dense legal document printed on thick cardstock. She produced a silver fountain pen, extending it toward me. "Because the necklace is a high-value historical asset, our insurance underwriters require a signature verifying you assume liability while wearing it," she explained, her tone casual and dismissive. "It is standard protocol for the family. Just sign at the bottom and we can clasp it around your neck." I stared at the document. The text was incredibly dense, filled with obscure legal jargon and tiny print. A sudden, sharp vibration against my thigh broke my concentration. My phone was tucked into a hidden pocket, sewn into the layers of my silk skirt. I slipped my hand down, retrieving the device under the guise of smoothing the heavy fabric. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Beatrice, who was sitting in the hotel lobby downstairs, monitoring the Sterling family legal filings through her judicial access portal. "Do not sign anything. It is a sweeping power of attorney. They are bypassing the prenup entirely." The words burned into my retinas. The trap was laid bare. Preston and Victoria had realized their forged prenuptial agreement might face a judicial challenge if I discovered the deepfake audio. They were executing a secondary failsafe. The document resting on my lap was not an insurance waiver. It was a legal instrument granting the Sterling Family Trust immediate, unfettered administrative control over my personal and corporate assets. If I refused to sign the document, Victoria would instantly realize her ruse had failed. She would know I possessed outside counsel and was actively fighting the takeover. She would signal Vanessa, who was currently standing by the window, holding her own phone. Vanessa would make the call and freeze my corporate accounts, locking away the millions I needed to save Lewis Capital. I would lose the element of surprise and my financial leverage in a single moment. But if I took the silver pen and signed my legal name, I surrendered the keys to my empire. I would authorize the theft of my own company, validating their criminal conspiracy with my own hand. I sat trapped in the heavy silk gown, the diamond collar glinting in the sunlight. Victoria tapped the silver pen against the document, her polite smile hardening into an expectant glare. Vanessa watched from the corner, her thumb hovering over the screen of her device. "We are on a tight schedule," Delwyn Victoria pressed, her voice dropping its warm maternal inflection. "Sign the paper." I reached out my fingers, closing around the cold metal barrel of the fountain pen. I had to find a third option. I had to sign the document to maintain my cover, but I had to do it in a way that rendered the ink legally radioactive. I stared down at the dotted line, the weight of my father's legacy pressing against my shoulders. I unhooked the cap of the pen, pressing the nib against the thick, fibrous paper. The nib of the silver fountain pen scratched across the thick, fibrous paper. I traced the curves of my legal signature, forming the letters with a slow, deliberate hand. The ink bled into the page, a dark navy stain that mocked the pristine white cardstock. I handed the leather folio back to Victoria. She did not smile. She knew a physical signature was merely ceremonial. In the high-stakes arena of Chicago acquisitions, ink on paper served as a ceremonial relic. The true transfer of administrative power over a multi-million-dollar entity demanded federal authentication. My primary financial institution mandated biometric verification for any sweeping changes to my personal and corporate trusts. Victoria understood this specific requirement. She had anticipated it, incorporating the modern security measure into her theft. From the deep pocket of her silk robe, she produced a sleek electronic notary pad. The device was encased in dark titanium, its glass screen glowing with a sterile blue light. She placed it on the velvet cushion next to me. The device was a direct uplink to the central banking servers, capable of binding the written contract with an undeniable digital seal. And now, the digital authorization to bind the insurance waiver she instructed. Her tone betrayed a faint tremor of anticipation. "Place your primary index finger on the scanner." This was the fulcrum upon which my entire survival balanced. 5 years ago, when I first incorporated Lewis Capital, my lead security architect insisted on extreme contingency protocols. We designed a defensive system to protect the firm from extortion, kidnapping, or coerced asset transfers. My right index finger was the true key to my kingdom. It unlocked the vaults, authorized the multi-million-dollar wires, and validated my executive power across all platforms. My left index finger, however, operated as a silent tripwire. If I pressed my left digit onto a banking scanner, the system would accept the biometric data and display a verified confirmation screen to the end user. To the untrained eye, the transaction appeared flawless and successful. But beneath the surface, in the hidden architecture of the banking software, that specific fingerprint initiated a catastrophic silent alarm. It was a registered distress cipher. Triggering it immediately initiated a federally mandated freeze on all connected accounts, invoking the Securities and Exchange Commission coercion protocols. It transformed the authorized document into a radioactive piece of evidence, flagging the recipient for immediate federal investigation. I looked up at Victoria. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing blue square. Hunger radiated from her rigid posture. She was a woman who had spent decades navigating country club politics and charitable galas, firmly believing her aristocratic pedigree made her intellectually superior to everyone in the room. She viewed me as a fortunate commoner. She knew nothing about the ruthless, invisible tripwires of modern corporate cybersecurity. I raised my hand. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, restricted by the tight silk boning of the bridal corset. I extended my left index finger. I pressed the pad of my skin against the cold glass of the scanner. The surface was smooth and unforgiving. A thin laser beam of light swept across my fingerprint, reading the unique ridges and valleys of my skin. For 2 agonizing seconds, the screen remained a solid blue. I held my breath, waiting for the software to process the distress signal and return the false positive. Then the screen flashed a brilliant emerald green. A cheerful automated chime echoed through the silent suite. Verification approved. The robotic text crawled across the display. Victoria exhaled a sharp breath. The tension vanished from her shoulders, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. She snatched the titanium device from the cushion, cradling it against her chest, as if she had just stolen the crown jewels. A smug, satisfied smirk spread across her face, pulling at the corners of her mouth. She believed she had just outsmarted a self-made chief executive. She thought she possessed the digital keys to Lewis Capital, granting her bankrupt family unfettered access to my liquid assets and saving her crumbling estate from ruin. "Thank you, Delwyn," she purred, slipping the electronic pad back into her robe alongside the silver pen. "The necklace is yours to wear. I must run down to the lobby and hand this off to our legal courier. He is waiting to file the paperwork before the ceremony begins. Do try to relax. You look a bit pale." She turned on her heel and glided out of the room. Her silk robe billowed behind her, catching the morning sunlight. The heavy double doors clicked shut, sealing her fate. A profound, agonizing satisfaction washed over me. I watched the space where she had just stood, savoring the dramatic irony of the moment. Victoria was currently strutting down the carpeted hallway of the Drake Hotel, feeling like a conqueror. She was entirely unaware she was carrying a functionally worthless instrument of her own destruction. The exact moment her lawyers attempted to execute that power of attorney, they would trip the federal alarm. They would lock their own digital doors and summon the full weight of the United States government down upon their fraudulent empire. She had essentially signed her own arrest warrant and thanked me for the privilege. But the silent victory was fleeting. The digital clock on the vanity read 8:19. The financial markets were open. The banking servers were running their daily automated security sweeps. I had successfully paralyzed the Sterling Family Trust, but my own corporate war chest remained highly vulnerable. I still needed to move my liquid capital into the blind offshore account before Vanessa executed her lockdown. Vanessa remained in the suite. She stood near the tall, arched window, peering through the sheer curtains down at the bustling Chicago streets below. Her back was turned to me. Her thumbs flew across the screen of her smartphone. She was typing rapidly, no doubt communicating with her inside contact at the investment bank, preparing to freeze my routing numbers and trap my capital. I stood up from the velvet sofa. The heavy silk skirt of the wedding gown dragged across the thick carpet, resisting my movements. The dress weighed 20 pounds, a beautiful cage designed to slow me down. I ignored the physical constraint, walking briskly toward the walk-in closet. I pushed the louvered doors open, scanning the dark interior. My hanging garment bag was pushed to the far corner, hidden behind a row of bridesmaid dresses. I reached inside, finding the hidden zipper compartment sewn into the lining. My fingers brushed against the familiar cold metal of my physical security token. I pulled the small drive free, clutching it tightly in my palm. I stepped back into the main suite, moving quietly toward the antique writing desk where my personal laptop sat closed and dormant. I opened the lid. The screen illuminated, casting a pale glow across my face. The encrypted portal to my corporate financial network was already staged and waiting for my final authorization, thanks to Elias. I just needed to plug the token into the side port and hit the execution key to drain the accounts. I held the metal drive, preparing to insert it into the machine. The silence in the room broke. "What exactly are you doing?" The voice was sharp and laced with deep suspicion. I froze. I turned my head slowly. Vanessa had stepped away from the arched window. Her phone was lowered, resting against her side. Her dark eyes were locked onto the glowing screen of my laptop. The smug indifference she usually wore had vanished entirely. She stared at the intricate banking interface reflecting in my eyes. She recognized the proprietary software. She knew a wire transfer portal when she saw one. I had outsmarted the mother, but the daughter was a different breed of predator. Vanessa took a slow, calculated step toward the desk, her gaze shifting from the computer screen to the tiny security token resting in my hand. The trap I had so carefully navigated was springing shut from a new, terrifying angle. An invisible current of tension electrified the air inside the luxurious suite. I remained entirely still beside the ornate writing desk, gripping the encrypted drive tightly within my closed fist. Vanessa closed the distance between us, moving with the terrifying fluid grace of a stalking predator. Her sharp heels sank into the thick Persian rug, making absolutely zero noise. The morning light washed over her flawless, deep amber complexion, illuminating the elaborate crown of micro-braids coiled atop her head. As my future sister-in-law, she had always projected an aura of bored, aristocratic indifference. But right now, her dark eyes burned with intense, calculating malice. She reached forward and violently shoved the screen of my computer downward. The hinges screamed in protest, snapping shut with a brutal crack that reverberated against the silk-covered walls. My pulse hammered a frantic, erratic rhythm inside my chest, but I forced my facial muscles to remain perfectly rigid and unbothered. "What exactly are you doing transferring corporate assets offshore 20 minutes before your own wedding ceremony?" she demanded. Her voice dropped into a lethal whisper, ensuring her interrogation would not bleed through the heavy wooden doors into the corridor. I slowed my breathing carefully, evaluating how much information she actually possessed. Vanessa was incredibly shrewd, unlike her deeply arrogant mother. Raised inside the suffocating, bankrupt reality of the Sterling estate, she had cultivated a ruthless survival instinct. While Preston enjoyed the endless grooming and adoration bestowed upon the male heir, Vanessa suffered a much different fate. She was treated merely as a strategic asset. 5 years ago, Victoria orchestrated a loveless marriage between her daughter and a senior banking executive, solely to acquire a desperately needed revolving credit line. Vanessa utterly despised her husband and harbored profound resentment toward her own bloodline. She maintained her position as the chief financial officer for their crumbling empire, not out of familial loyalty, but because it granted her total visibility into their impending ruin. "I am simply executing a scheduled vendor payment," I lied, smoothly maintaining a bright conversational tone. The luxury catering firm required their final installment before the grand reception begins downstairs. "Do not insult my intelligence, Delwyn," she hissed, leaning closer until her expensive jasmine perfume mingled sickeningly with the overwhelming scent of the floral arrangements. I saw the interface reflection. "That is a Tier 1 administrative portal. You are staging a massive liquidation of your holding accounts. You know about the bankruptcy." The naive bride facade shattered completely. There was zero utility in pretending any longer. I lifted my chin, meeting her furious glare with a cold stare I had perfected during countless hostile boardroom takeovers. "I know your trust is currently drowning under $40 million in defaulted federal loans," I countered, stripping the musical lilt from my voice. "I know the Internal Revenue Service has initiated a silent audit of your estate. Furthermore, I am fully aware your brother forged a fraudulent addendum to my prenuptial agreement, intending to seize my liquid capital the moment we exchange our vows." Vanessa let out a dark, low chuckle, folding her arms across her chest. Her reaction completely derailed my expectations. She offered no defense for her sibling. She presented no denial regarding the allegations. Instead, she studied me with an expression that closely resembled genuine admiration. "My foolish brother always severely underestimated you," she murmured, shaking her head slowly. "He assumed your status as a young, self-made woman meant you would easily succumb to our aristocratic pedigree. He is a spectacular idiot. However, his staggering incompetence presents a highly lucrative opportunity for both of us right now." She slammed her hand flat against the closed lid of my machine, physically blocking my access. She represented the ultimate unpredictable hurdle standing between my company and total salvation. "I will remove my hand," she proposed, her inflection shifting from accusatory to strictly transactional. "I will turn my back, stroll out onto the balcony, and admire the beautiful view of Lake Michigan. I will allow you to plug in your little metal key and drain every single penny out of Lewis Capital before my family can steal it. But my temporary blindness requires a very specific fee." I stared at her, feeling the immense weight of the imported silk gown dragging heavily against my legs. "What exactly is your price?" I asked, measuring every syllable. $2 million, she stated without blinking. "Wire the funds directly into my private offshore account immediately. You are moving hundreds of millions right now, Delwyn. $2 million represents a meaningless rounding error for your firm, but for me, it provides a permanent exit ticket out of this highly toxic nightmare. It supplies the necessary capital for me to file divorce papers, abandon my mother to the federal auditors, and vanish into Europe before the government indictments drop. Pay my toll, and you keep your entire empire intact. The brazen demand hung suspended in the quiet room, thick and poisonous. It was a spectacularly vicious maneuver. She was actively leveraging her own family's criminal conspiracy to extort me for personal gain. For a fleeting microsecond, I genuinely considered paying the bribe. $2 million indeed constituted a tiny fraction of my overall net worth. Yielding would guarantee instant access to the banking terminal. Then my analytical mind recalled the absolute foundational laws of corporate litigation. Paying Vanessa met the exact legal definition of extortion. If I wired millions to a hostile party under extreme duress while simultaneously attempting to conceal my own assets, the federal courts would categorize the entire sequence as illicit financial activity. Submitting to her demand would legally invalidate my entire defensive posture. A presiding judge could easily interpret the bribe as evidence that I actively participated in a fraudulent scheme to defraud my future spouse. My hands would instantly become legally unclean. I could never negotiate with financial terrorists. I completely refuse, I stated, my voice resonating with absolute, unyielding finality. Vanessa narrowed her eyes, her jaw clenching tight. Then I will pick up my device and call my inside banking contact right now, she threatened, withdrawing her smartphone from her beaded clutch. I will freeze your routing numbers permanently. You lose absolutely everything. I needed to deploy a catastrophic bluff. I had to weaponize her own deep-seated paranoia against her. I took one aggressive step forward, invading her personal space and forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "Make the phone call, Vanessa," I challenged, my tone dripping with freezing confidence. "Contact your associate. But before you dial, you must fully understand exactly what transpired when your mother exited this room 5 minutes ago." Vanessa frowned the phone, pausing halfway to her ear. What did she do? She forced me to sign a sweeping power of attorney using an electronic notary pad. I explained constructing the massive fabrication with terrifying conviction. But I did not authorize the document using my primary biometric signature. I utilized a federally registered distress cipher. Do you comprehend what that implies within the modern banking sector, Vanessa? Her previously impenetrable confidence began to fracture. Her flawless, deep complexion paled noticeably. "What exactly did you do?" she whispered. "It means the Securities and Exchange Commission has already received an alert regarding a coerced asset transfer." I lied, pushing the aggressive narrative even harder. "It means federal agents are currently monitoring every single digital transaction routing through this exact Internet Protocol address. If you attempt to access my accounts or interfere with my authorized transfers, you cease being a mere bystander. You immediately become an active participant in criminal wire fraud." I watched her brilliant mind process the fabricated threat. She possessed immense financial acumen, but she lacked the specialized cybersecurity expertise necessary to verify my claim. She already knew federal investigators were circling her crumbling estate like hungry vultures. The terrifying possibility that she might accidentally step directly into an active government sting operation paralyzed her. The standard penalty for malicious corporate wire fraud equals 20 years in federal prison. I added, softly delivering the ultimate psychological strike. "You desperately want to escape your mother. If you prevent me from opening this computer, you will spend the next 2 decades sharing a tiny concrete cell with her. Walk away, Vanessa. Save yourself." She stared at me, her chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. The intense self-preservation instincts she had honed over a lifetime of emotional abuse finally eclipsed her greed. Her hand trembled visibly. She lowered the phone, dropping it back into her silk bag. She took a slow, highly deliberate step backward, retreating completely away from the desk. "You are vastly more dangerous than Preston ever comprehended," she breathed, her voice shaking violently. I did not waste another precious second. I flipped the screen open, the hinges groaning loudly under the sudden force. The encrypted portal glowed brightly, demanding my final verification input. I jammed the physical token into the side port. The proprietary software instantly recognized the drive. A new confirmation window populated the display, asking for execution authority. I pressed the Enter key with a deeply satisfying, definitive strike. The loading graphic spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the entire screen flashed a brilliant, calming green hue. Transfer complete. $140 million of liquid capital vanished instantly from the vulnerable holding accounts, perfectly rerouted into an impenetrable offshore structure. The Sterling trap was officially empty. I had successfully secured my life work. I pulled the token from the machine, sliding it safely back into my hidden pocket. A sharp, rhythmic knocking echoed loudly from the heavy wooden doors. The sudden noise jolted both me and Vanessa out of our tense, silent standoff. "Miss Lewis," a cheerful, muffled voice called from the exterior hallway. "It is your wedding coordinator. The guests are fully seated. The string quartet is playing the prelude music. We need you downstairs in the grand foyer right now. It is time to line up for the procession." I closed my laptop, sliding it gracefully into my leather briefcase. I turned toward the full-length mirror, adjusting the heavy diamond collar Victoria had locked securely around my neck. The glittering stones felt cold against my collarbone, but they no longer represented my captivity. They were merely theatrical props for the final act of this corporate warfare. I looked at Vanessa through the glass reflection. She stood completely frozen, watching me with a complex mixture of sheer terror and absolute awe. The silent game of hidden transfers was completely over. It was time to walk down the aisle and publicly annihilate the man who foolishly believed he could steal my throne. I took a deep breath, letting the heavy silk train cascade elegantly behind me. The ultimate showdown had finally arrived. The massive, heavy oak doors of the majestic Gothic cathedral swung open, revealing a cavernous, magnificent sanctuary. A collective intake of breath rustled through the enormous congregation as I stepped across the grand threshold. The soaring, vaulted ceiling stretched endlessly upward, illuminated by thousands of flickering candles, casting a warm, golden glow against the cold gray stone walls. The pungent scent of burning myrrh and fresh white lilies hung thick in the air, creating an intoxicating, slightly suffocating atmosphere. 400 of the most powerful individuals residing in the city occupied the dark, polished wooden pews. I recognized prominent venture capitalists who had previously attempted to acquire my firm, sitting alongside federal judges and influential corporate media executives. They represented the absolute apex of the financial hierarchy, gathered entirely to witness the strategic merging of old aristocratic blood and new self-made wealth. This grand, highly visible public arena represented a terrifying shift in the ongoing psychological warfare. The brutal battles fought inside the dimly lit dining room in Oak Park and the confined, luxurious prison of the bridal suite were strictly private skirmishes. Now, every single microexpression was subjected to the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of high society. The professional string quartet positioned near the ornate choir loft began playing a hauntingly beautiful classical arrangement. My heart slammed violently against my ribcage, sinking with the heavy, rhythmic thud of my white satin heels striking the ancient marble floor. Each measured step forward felt incredibly laborious, burdened by the massive physical weight of the imported silk gown and the explosive, destructive secret burning inside my mind. I focused my vision strictly straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the subtle murmurs rippling through the wealthy audience. Halfway down the long center aisle, I spotted my Aunt Beatrice, seated quietly in the very first row, reserved exclusively for the family of the bride. She wore an impeccably tailored navy suit, projecting fierce, regal authority among the sea of pastel dresses. Her dark, intelligent eyes locked onto mine, transmitting a silent, powerful message of unyielding solidarity. As a highly respected corporate litigator, Beatrice possessed a profound, comprehensive understanding of the exact legal mechanisms currently in motion. She knew I had successfully drained the vulnerable holding accounts. She knew Victoria was blindly clutching a financially toxic document downstairs. Our shared strategic knowledge functioned as an invisible, impenetrable shield, deflecting the suffocating pressure emanating from the surrounding crowd. At the far end of the long crimson runner stood my treacherous future husband. Preston looked utterly flawless, dressed in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that perfectly accentuated his tall, athletic build and sharp patrician features. He possessed the striking, charismatic appearance of a man bred entirely for endless success. Since his early childhood, his wealthy parents had carefully cultivated his pristine public persona, grooming him to assume total control of the vast family empire. He was widely considered the undisputed golden boy of the financial district, a fabricated title maintained exclusively through aggressive public relations campaigns and a deliberate, systematic concealment of his staggering professional incompetence. He smiled warmly as I approached, radiating a sickeningly false adoration, specifically designed to convince the hundreds of watching eyes that our union was born of genuine, profound love. I finally reached the majestic altar, ascending the 3 short carpeted steps to join him. He reached out, taking my trembling hands in his. His palms felt slightly clammy, betraying a subtle underlying nervous anxiety. I arranged my facial features into a pristine, unreadable mask of joyful devotion, suppressing the intense, overwhelming urge to violently pull my hands away from his deceitful grasp. We turned slightly, facing the aging religious officiant standing patiently behind the ornate carved wooden pulpit. "You look absolutely breathtaking," Preston murmured, leaning his head close to mine under the guise of an intimate romantic gesture. His lips barely brushed against my earlobe, but his words contained zero genuine affection. His voice dropped into a dark, deeply possessive register meant exclusively for my ears. Our legal team filed the final structural addendum 10 minutes ago, my brilliant, beautiful bride. Everything you built belongs completely to us now. We are going to restructure your entire executive board tomorrow morning. A sharp, agonizing spike of pure, venomous rage pierced directly through my chest. The sheer audacity of his cruel whisper, the arrogant, absolute certainty that he had successfully orchestrated my professional execution was staggering. He was openly gloating, standing confidently in the sacred house of worship, believing he had fully consumed my independent identity. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth throbbed with dull pain. I desperately wanted to unleash the devastating truth immediately. I wanted to scream loudly that his family was entirely bankrupt and his mother had just accidentally triggered a massive federal investigation. But I was legally bound by the strict, uncompromising parameters of the original prenuptial agreement I had signed several months prior. That specific legal contract contained an aggressive financial penalty clause, explicitly dictated by Beatrice during the initial drafting phase. If either party publicly abandoned the ceremonial proceedings prior to the formal exchange of vows, the fleeing individual automatically forfeited $5 million in immediate liquid damages. Striking too early, breaking the pristine theatrical facade before the exact, correct procedural moment, would instantly trigger that massive, catastrophic penalty. I could not allow Preston to siphon a single dollar from my protected accounts. I had to wait patiently for the religious ceremony to progress, ensuring the legal threshold was crossed, where my defensive actions became perfectly legally justified under the established parameters of the contract. I swallowed the burning, acidic anger, offering him a tiny, demure smile. "We shall see what tomorrow brings," I whispered back, my voice entirely devoid of any readable emotion. Preston looked momentarily confused by my remarkably neutral response, but the officiant cleared his throat loudly, commanding the immediate attention of the massive room. The low, murmuring hum of the congregation instantly vanished, entirely replaced by an absolute, breathless, heavy silence. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God in the presence of these honored witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The officiant began his deep, resonant baritone voice, echoing powerfully into the high, acoustic vaulted ceilings. The sacred marriage covenant is a profound, vital foundation requiring absolute honesty, mutual respect, and an unwavering, lifelong commitment to truth. I listened carefully to the traditional opening words, analyzing the bitter, hypocritical irony of the solemn speech. There was zero honesty residing within this fraudulent union. It was a hostile, aggressive corporate acquisition, cleverly disguised in white silk lace and expensive imported floral arrangements. The officiant continued reading the familiar religious passages, praising the noble virtues of patience and long-suffering endurance. The physical tension inside my body amplified significantly, with every passing second reaching an almost unbearable, volatile boiling point. I was a fully armed, ticking bomb standing squarely in the center of the city elite, waiting patiently for the final authorized trigger to be pulled. The formal ceremony progressed slowly through the opening prayers, finally arriving at the critical procedural juncture. The officiant deliberately closed his heavy leather-bound book, resting his aged hands gently upon the smooth wooden surface of the pulpit. He shifted his serious gaze from Preston directly to me, and then looked outward, sweeping his eyes across the hundreds of prominent, wealthy guests seated quietly in the dark oak pews. Therefore, if any person can show any just legal cause or valid impediment why these two individuals may not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace, he declared firmly. The heavy, crucial question hung suspended in the chilled, fragrant air of the grand sanctuary. Historically, within modern society, this specific moment served merely as a quaint formality, a brief dramatic pause before the joyful exchange of wedding rings. The massive, sophisticated audience remained completely silent, fully expecting the officiant to continue the standard, predictable progression of the traditional script. Preston squeezed my hands firmly, a subtle physical command to remain perfectly still and compliant. He was completely blind to the catastrophic, destructive storm about to break directly over his head. The necessary legal threshold had finally been officially crossed. The required contractual moment presented itself clearly. I did not need to forfeit $5 million. The vital question of legal impediment had been officially raised by the presiding, recognized authority. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands entirely out of his tight, confident grasp. The sudden, unexpected separation caused Preston to flinch, his pale blue eyes widening in genuine, sudden alarm. I did not say a single word to him. I did not offer any verbal explanation or theatrical, dramatic declaration to the confused officiant. Instead, I turned my body entirely away from the ornate, flower-draped altar. The heavy, intricate silk train of the gown swept dramatically across the polished marble floor, making a loud, rushing sound that echoed violently through the dead, quiet church. I squared my shoulders proudly, lifting my chin high. I looked out over the vast sea of shocked, bewildered faces, staring directly into the eyes of the most powerful, influential people in the entire city. The perfectly constructed, fragile facade of the naive, blushing bride instantly evaporated, entirely replaced by the cold, calculating, terrifying presence of a chief executive officer preparing to publicly dismantle a fraudulent, bankrupt empire. I faced the enormous crowd, ready to deliver the final, spectacular, lethal blow. I stepped away from the elaborate floral altar, leaving my deceitful groom standing in complete, stunned isolation. The physical space between our bodies widened rapidly, feeling like an immense, dangerous chasm opening directly beneath the soaring vaulted ceiling. The elderly religious officiant stared at me, his deeply wrinkled face completely pale with profound confusion. Reverend Thomas had faithfully served the elite parishes of the greater Chicago metropolitan area for nearly 5 decades, carefully managing the delicate spiritual optics of the most powerful corporate dynasties. He possessed absolutely zero practical experience dealing with an open, hostile rebellion during a live, highly broadcasted matrimonial ceremony. I reached forward, extending my right hand deliberately toward the sleek silver microphone positioned securely upon the carved wooden pulpit. He instinctively pulled the delicate metal stand backward, desperately trying to preserve the quiet, sacred decorum of his historic church. I did not retreat or hesitate. I gripped the cold, metallic shaft with uncompromising executive authority, yanking the electronic device smoothly away from the restraining plastic clip. A sharp burst of loud static feedback shrieked through the towering acoustic speakers, instantly silencing the rising, curious murmurs of the confused congregation. I turned my body slowly to fully face the 400 distinguished guests seated patiently before me. The heavy, oppressive silence, pressing down upon the enormous room, felt incredibly thick and physically suffocating. These specific individuals represented the absolute apex of modern American capitalism. They were ruthless venture capitalists, prominent federal appellate judges, and highly influential media moguls who built their entire lucrative careers upon recognizing sudden opportunities and rapidly evading disastrous financial liabilities. I held the active microphone very near my mouth, my racing pulse finally steadying as the chaotic adrenaline crystallized rapidly into pure, freezing, tactical focus. "I am officially canceling this wedding, proceeding immediately," I announced loudly, my voice echoing with lethal, unshaken clarity across the cavernous, empty airspace of the sanctuary. "This union is permanently terminated due to gross, deliberate fraud, malicious, organized financial conspiracy, and highly assertive attempted extortion perpetrated by the Sterling estate." Absolute chaotic pandemonium erupted instantly within the polished, dark oak pews. Several prominent wealthy socialites gasped audibly, clutching their expensive pearl necklaces in theatrical, exaggerated horror. The seasoned corporate investors exchanged rapid, cold, calculating glances, instantly evaluating the severe, impending market implications of my explosive public statement. Preston rapidly recovered from his initial frozen paralysis, his perfectly manicured, charming facade cracking severely under the crushing weight of the sudden public humiliation. "Delwyn, stop this insane, pathetic theatrical nonsense right now," he hissed angrily, stepping forcefully toward my elevated position. He reached his long arms outward, attempting desperately to snatch the sensitive audio equipment directly from my firm grasp and somehow salvage his rapidly disintegrating public image before the watching media. I perfectly anticipated his clumsy maneuver, stepping nimbly backward, entirely out of his immediate physical reach. I swiftly retrieved my personal smartphone from the hidden interior pocket, concealed carefully beneath the heavy, thick layers of my imported silk bridal gown. My thumb quickly swiped across the illuminated glass screen, instantly activating the digital media player application. I pressed the tiny mobile device directly against the sensitive microphone capsule, heavily amplifying the raw, uncut digital recording captured stealthily by my smartwatch the previous dark evening. The crystal-clear audio file blasted forcefully through the gigantic cathedral speakers, exposing their darkest, ugliest family secrets to the entire stunned city. Victoria spoke first, her distinct, aristocratic, condescending sneer echoing ominously around the stone walls. "We must secure 51% of Lewis Capital before she realizes the true, devastating extent of our total insolvency." Then the unmistakable, entitled voice of my former handsome groom replied, dripping with callous, arrogant, casual cruelty. "The prenuptial addendum is already perfectly forged, Mother. Once the diamond ring is securely on her finger, her entire lucrative company belongs wholly to us." The damning digital audio evidence hung suspended in the cold, fragrant air, absolutely irrefutable and devastatingly precise. The short recorded conversation represented a catastrophic nuclear strike against their carefully maintained, pristine societal reputation. Preston froze solid, his outstretched arm dropping limply back to his side. The sickening, horrifying realization that I possessed intimate, comprehensive knowledge of their entire criminal enterprise finally successfully penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. His handsome, symmetrical face drained rapidly of all natural color, transforming quickly into a ghostly white mask of profound terror. Down in the very first row, Victoria violently slumped against the hard wooden armrest, her famously rigid posture collapsing entirely as the horrific, impending reality of her public destruction materialized before her eyes. The relentless onslaught was, however, far from concluded. Simultaneous with the final echoed, dying syllables of the incriminatory digital recording, a highly formidable figure rose smoothly upwards from the prime reserved family seating area. Aunt Beatrice calmly smoothed the lapels of her impeccable dark navy blazer, projecting a terrifying aura of immense judicial authority. Beatrice spent 30 long, brutal years prosecuting corrupt, greedy corporate executives inside the unforgiving federal courtrooms of the Northern District. She was a brilliant, ruthless legal predator who genuinely relished the precise, systematic dismantling of arrogant, wealthy, white-collar criminals. She did not merely walk up the carpeted altar stairs. She marched upward with the measured, steady, terrifying cadence of an official executioner ascending the wooden scaffold. She bypassed the trembling officiant completely, marching directly toward the deeply humiliated, paralyzed groom. From her large leather professional satchel, she withdrew a remarkably thick, heavy stack of drafted civil lawsuits bound securely with thick rubber bands. She slapped the heavy legal documents directly against his broad chest, forcing him to reflexively catch the extensive paperwork before it scattered across the polished marble floor. "You are formally served, Preston," she declared loudly, her powerful, commanding voice projecting effortlessly, perfectly, without requiring any electronic assistance. These extensive filings include massive civil claims for coordinated financial fraud, intentional malicious infliction of emotional distress, and systemic egregious breach of fiduciary duty. Our dedicated forensic accounting team has already successfully petitioned the federal district court to instantly freeze every single remaining liquid asset connected remotely to your completely bankrupt bloodline. The sheer overwhelming magnitude of the legal ambush finally violently shattered the very last remaining fragile fragments of his carefully manufactured psychological restraint. Beneath the polished, expensive, meticulous grooming, Preston secretly harbored a deeply volatile, violently suppressed, dangerous temper. He spent his entire privileged, wealthy existence operating entirely without facing a single, tangible, negative consequence for his incredibly destructive, selfish actions. Confronted suddenly by his total public ruin, his internal psychological dam broke open. A guttural, terrifying, animalistic snarl ripped aggressively from his tightened throat. His pale blue eyes turned completely dark with raw, unadulterated, vicious hatred. He lunged forcefully forward with terrifying, unexpected, explosive speed. His large, strong hands hooking violently around my left bare arm. His physical grip was brutal and deeply painful, his long fingers digging maliciously into my soft skin, actively attempting to physically dominate the much smaller woman who had just systematically annihilated his entire bright future. The horrific, shocking breach of standard physical decorum sent massive shockwaves rippling through the elite, wealthy audience. Dozens of professional high society photographers, originally hired simply to document a joyous, romantic, elegant celebration, instinctively raised their heavy professional cameras. Brilliant white flashbulbs erupted continuously, rapidly bathing the violent physical altercation in blinding, continuous bursts of intense, harsh light. They were actively capturing the exact, defining, historic moment. The beloved golden boy of Chicago high society mutated horribly into a desperate physical abuser. On the front page of absolutely every major national financial publication. I did not scream, cry, or panic wildly. I utilized the precise, effective defensive physical leverage techniques Beatrice had stubbornly insisted I master perfectly many years ago. I rotated my left shoulder sharply downward, dropping my entire core body weight heavily and twisting my captured wrist forcefully against his exposed, weak thumb joint. The sudden, agonizing, sharp pressure forced his tight, abusive grip to break instantly. I spun quickly away from his dangerous reach, staring him down intensely with absolute, freezing, undeniable contempt. "You are a truly pathetic, weak little coward," I stated very quietly, ensuring only he could clearly hear the final, devastating personal judgment. Before he could possibly attempt another disastrous physical assault, a massive, impenetrable human wall of dark gray suits materialized instantly between us. Beatrice had secretly, strategically contracted an elite, expensive private security firm, staffing the entire cathedral perimeter with highly trained, dangerous former military operatives, cleverly disguised as standard polite ushers. 6 incredibly large, extremely imposing, muscular men formed a tight, defensive, protective semicircle completely around my body, violently pushing Preston backward, away from me, with undeniable, overwhelming physical force. The head of the security detail, a towering, broad man with cold, empty, dead eyes, placed his large, flat hand firmly, solidly, against the chest of my enraged attacker. "Take exactly one more step toward my client, and I will absolutely break your jaw," the security chief warned softly, his deep tone remarkably casual, yet utterly terrifying. The grand historic cathedral devolved instantly into absolute, complete, total chaos, with wealthy, panicked guests shouting loudly, prominent attorneys making frantic, urgent phone calls, and aggressive photographers snapping endless, rapid pictures. Preston stood trapped helplessly behind the solid human barricade, his chest heaving, utterly defeated and publicly humiliated, completely beyond any possible hope of future redemption. But the ultimate, astonishing, satisfying conclusion of the dramatic morning was only just arriving at the venue. The massive, heavy wooden double doors located at the very rear of the enormous echoing church suddenly violently burst open with a deafening, massive crash that echoed loudly over the ongoing pandemonium. 10 heavily armed, serious federal agents, wearing dark protective tactical vests prominently emblazoned with the bright yellow bold letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stormed aggressively into the long center aisle. They completely bypassed the chaotic altar situation entirely, marching with terrifying, unified purpose directly straight toward the front row pews. They swiftly surrounded Victoria, who was currently still clutching her useless, expensive, silver velvet purse, in total shock. "Victoria Sterling, you are placed under immediate federal arrest for criminal corporate wire fraud and systemic attempted extortion, initiated automatically by a biometric banking security alarm triggered remotely from the Drake Hotel," the lead senior agent announced loudly, producing heavy, shining steel handcuffs. The silent digital trap I carefully set inside the luxurious bridal suite had finally snapped entirely shut, dragging the arrogant matriarch screaming wildly into the brutal, unforgiving reality of the modern American criminal justice system. The federal agents moved down the central aisle with unwavering precision. Their heavy dark boots struck the ancient polished marble floor with a terrifying, synchronized rhythm that cut sharply through the widespread panic. The powerful matriarch of the Sterling family found herself fundamentally cornered. The shining steel handcuffs gleamed ominously under the warm golden light of the soaring vaulted ceiling. She stared at the lead criminal investigator, her normally flawless complexion pale and utterly devoid of its usual aristocratic arrogance. For several long decades, Victoria had consistently utilized her immense generational wealth and prominent social standing as an impenetrable shield against any severe legal consequences. She had famously avoided a devastating state charity foundation audit 10 years prior by miraculously contracting a severe case of sudden pneumonia the exact same day the regional inspectors arrived at her sprawling residential estate. She possessed a legendary, unparalleled talent for weaponizing human vulnerability to escape any form of judicial accountability. Now facing the absolute public destruction of her pristine societal image and the very real, terrifying threat of a prolonged federal prison sentence, she rapidly calculated her dwindling odds of survival. She knew the elite members of high society sitting frozen in the dark wooden pews despised messy, aggressive public scandals. These wealthy venture capitalists and powerful federal judges valued quiet, dignified decorum, high above actual moral justice. They could easily forgive secret, malicious financial fraud, but they would never tolerate a loud, chaotic government arrest during a sacred matrimonial ceremony. Realizing she had utterly lost the strategic narrative and the crucial moral high ground, Victoria executed a desperate, highly calculated tactical maneuver. She raised her trembling right hand, pressing it forcefully against the center of her chest. Her eyes rolled backward, exposing the white sclera as she let out a loud, ragged, desperate gasp for air. The terrifying, agonizing sound echoed violently across the cavernous sanctuary, instantly silencing the chaotic murmuring of the horrified prominent guests. Her knees buckled completely beneath her expensive imported silk dress, and she collapsed heavily against the hard, polished wood of the front row pew. The heavy vintage diamond necklace adorning her throat snapped sharply under the sudden, brutal impact. Dozens of glittering precious stones scattered wildly across the smooth marble floor with a sharp, distinct clattering noise that rang out like broken glass. Mother Preston screamed the word, his voice raw and thick with sudden, overwhelming panic. He shoved aggressively past the formidable human wall of private security operatives, his previous, violent, explosive rage completely replaced by frantic, theatrical desperation. He dropped heavily to his knees beside the fallen woman, tearing frantically at the tight, stiff collar of his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. "Somebody call an emergency ambulance right now," he yelled, glaring fiercely up at the paralyzed, wealthy crowd. The seasoned federal agents instinctively stepped backward, their tight tactical formation, breaking apart as they quickly assessed the sudden, severe medical emergency. The lead government investigator spoke rapidly into the secure communication device attached tightly to his broad shoulder, requesting immediate professional medical services. The entire psychological atmosphere within the massive historic cathedral shifted dramatically in a single instant. The initial profound shock regarding the serious criminal wire fraud allegations completely evaporated from the room. It was rapidly replaced by a dense, heavy, suffocating blanket of profound, misplaced sympathy for the collapsed older woman. I stood perfectly still upon the elevated, carpeted altar, watching the elaborate, deceptive, theatrical performance unfold directly below me. My Aunt Beatrice moved slowly to my side, her dark, intelligent eyes narrowed in deep, cynical suspicion. She recognized the manipulative, defensive tactic immediately. We had just publicly exposed a massive, malicious financial conspiracy, but the fickle, wealthy audience was already actively rewriting the historical narrative. The elite citizens attending the opulent ceremony possessed a deeply flawed, superficial moral compass. They viewed corporate theft as a simple, unfortunate misunderstanding between ambitious business partners. However, they viewed the public humiliation of an elderly, established socialite as an unforgivable, brutal transgression against their established social order. A harsh, highly critical whisper emerged from the third row, carrying clearly up to the quiet altar. "She pushed that poor, frail woman way too far," the voice murmured, dripping with intense, obvious disapproval. Another distinct voice quickly joined the rising chorus of severe condemnation. This was a completely heartless, ruthless corporate execution, not a joyous wedding, another guest added, shaking his head in absolute, pure disgust. I watched the prominent editor-in-chief of the local financial newspaper pull his mobile phone out from his tailored suit jacket, his thumbs flying across the glass screen to alert his publishing team. The psychological tide of the massive room had turned entirely against me. I had successfully defended my independent, lucrative company from a hostile, aggressive takeover, but I was rapidly losing the vital subsequent war of public perception. The collective narrative was actively shifting, painting me as a vicious, calculating monster who maliciously drove her elderly future mother-in-law to suffer a near-fatal, catastrophic cardiac event. The brilliant, undeniable tactical victory I had secured just moments prior was crumbling rapidly into worthless ashes right before my very eyes. The heavy, ornate wooden doors at the rear of the towering church burst open once again. A specialized team of 4 emergency medical technicians rushed down the long crimson runner, pushing a lightweight, metallic medical stretcher. They moved with frantic, highly urgent speed, completely ignoring the stunned federal agents and the wealthy, whispering socialites. They reached the front row pew, shoving aggressively past me to quickly access the fallen patient. One paramedic quickly secured a clear plastic oxygen mask over the pale face of the matriarch, while another rapidly attached colorful electronic monitoring wires to her delicate wrists and chest. "Her pulse is highly erratic," the lead medical technician announced loudly, checking a portable, glowing digital monitor. "We need to transport her to the cardiac intensive care unit immediately before the cardiovascular rhythm fails completely." They lifted her limp, fragile body expertly onto the padded canvas stretcher, strapping her securely in place with thick nylon belts. Preston walked closely beside the rushing medical team, his handsome face buried deeply in his hands, projecting the perfect, flawless image of a devastated, exceptionally loyal son. He had spent his entire adult life failing upward, constantly relying on the sympathy of others to excuse his profound professional incompetence. This manufactured crisis fed perfectly into his perpetual victimhood complex. The entire elite congregation watched the solemn medical procession with tearful, highly sympathetic eyes. They had completely forgotten about the stolen 51% equity scheme and the forged, illegal prenuptial addendum. They only saw a tragic, broken, noble family victimized by a cruel, incredibly vindictive young bride. As the rushing emergency team maneuvered the loaded stretcher past the front edge of the carved wooden pulpit, the wheels caught slightly on the thick, raised edge of the crimson carpet. The brief physical delay lasted only a single, fleeting second, but it provided exactly enough time for the ultimate, chilling reveal. The paramedic pushing the front of the cart turned his head backward to coordinate the awkward movement with his partner. For a tiny, microscopic fraction of a moment, the frail, dying older woman dropped her pathetic theatrical act entirely. Victoria turned her head slightly, resting her cheek against the thin, white hospital pillow. She looked directly upward, past the plastic condensation of the oxygen mask, and locked her dark, calculating eyes precisely onto mine. The overwhelming physical weakness and apparent confusion vanished entirely from her sharp gaze. It was replaced instantly by a look of pure, unadulterated, venomous triumph. Her lips moved slightly, forming 3 distinct, terrifying words meant exclusively for my eyes alone. "You are done." The chilling, silent threat hit my chest like a solid, physical blow. The paramedics quickly corrected the wheel alignment and rushed the stretcher rapidly down the center aisle, disappearing through the grand arched doorway into the bright afternoon sunlight. The federal agents followed closely behind them, effectively neutralizing the immediate physical threat of an ongoing public arrest. The sprawling church remained deadly quiet, filled entirely with 400 hostile pairs of eyes staring upward at me with intense, unified loathing. I had severely underestimated the boundless depths of her sheer, malicious cunning. Victoria had successfully weaponized her own physical health, transforming a devastating legal defeat into a magnificent, flawless public relations victory. She had brilliantly escaped immediate federal custody and completely ruined my hard-earned social standing within a single, calculated breath. Beatrice placed a reassuring, warm hand gently upon my rigid shoulder. "Do not let these foolish people see you falter," she instructed quietly, her voice steady and commanding. "We won the vital legal battle today, Delwyn. The massive financial assets are completely secure offshore." I nodded slowly, acknowledging the factual truth of her statement. The liquid capital remained perfectly safe, protected by the complex biometric digital cipher I had successfully deployed inside the hotel suite. My corporate empire was structurally entirely intact. But as I surveyed the angry, disgusted faces of the most influential media executives and powerful institutional investors in the city, I realized the structural integrity of my company was no longer the primary existential issue. The Sterling family possessed deep, extensive historical connections within the global financial news networks. By tomorrow morning, every single major business publication would feature a massive, full-page photograph of Victoria collapsing in apparent agony. The sensational headlines would completely ignore the verified digital audio recording of their criminal plot. Instead, they would focus entirely upon the aggressive, allegedly heartless behavior of the young, self-made female executive who ruthlessly attacked a beloved, prominent, philanthropic family at the altar. The modern stock market reacted viciously and swiftly to bad corporate publicity. If the major investors believed I was a volatile, cruel, and unhinged leader, they would rapidly pull their massive funding lines without hesitation. The board of directors would undoubtedly call an emergency executive session to question my overall fitness for the chief executive role. The stock price of Lewis Capital would completely plummet long before the opening trading bell even rang. The brutal war had merely shifted its active battlefields. We had survived the legal ambush, only to step directly onto a massive, active public relations landmine. The coming Monday morning would absolutely bring a catastrophic heavy storm of negative press, severe investor panic, and intense institutional instability. I needed to formulate an entirely new, aggressive, counteroffensive strategy immediately to survive the incoming wave. I turned away from the hostile staring crowd, gripping the heavy layers of my wedding dress tightly in my fists. I had exactly 48 hours to completely dismantle the Sterling family media machine before it completely destroyed everything I had ever built. The cold, gray morning light filtered heavily through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom, casting long, harsh shadows across the polished mahogany table. I stood completely silently at the head of the massive room, watching a single, solitary droplet of rain trace a jagged, erratic path down the thick, insulated glass. The sprawling, magnificent skyline of downtown Chicago stretched out endlessly before me, usually a profound source of immense personal pride and fierce, unstoppable ambition. Today, however, the towering steel skyscrapers resembled sharp, jagged teeth, ready to completely devour everything I had painstakingly built from the ground up. The pristine, quiet atmosphere of the high-altitude corporate sanctuary offered absolutely zero protection from the devastating, absolute carnage unfolding entirely outside these walls. 7 highly influential corporate directors occupied the plush, leather chairs surrounding the long table. These were the exact same seasoned industry veterans who had enthusiastically championed my brilliant, aggressive expansion strategies just last quarter. Now, they shifted nervously in their expensive seats, refusing completely to make direct eye contact with me. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere inside the room was incredibly thick, with absolute sheer panic and barely concealed bitter resentment. At the opposite end of the table sat Marcus, a deeply conservative venture capitalist who controlled the largest voting block of our institutional shares. Marcus grew up in a traditional, wealthy East Coast household where public scandals were considered the ultimate, unforgivable social sin. He valued quiet, steady, predictable market growth above all other metrics. His bald head gleamed slightly under the recessed lighting as he furiously scrolled through the rapidly plunging pre-market trading data on his digital tablet. He possessed absolutely zero loyalty to my personal vision, relying entirely upon cold, hard mathematical projections. The disastrous, catastrophic events of the weekend had entirely spiraled into an unprecedented, apocalyptic public relations nightmare. The Sterling family media machine had spent the entire past 48 hours executing a flawless, utterly devastating smear campaign across every major global news network. They completely buried the digital audio recording of their criminal conspiracy under an overwhelming avalanche of highly manufactured emotional outrage. Victoria remained comfortably sequestered inside a luxurious private suite at the Regional Cardiac Hospital, recovering from her entirely fabricated medical episode. Meanwhile, Preston masterfully played the role of the deeply traumatized, devastated groom on national daytime television. He gave several tearful, highly scripted interviews describing me as deeply paranoid, severely mentally unstable, and prone to violent, unpredictable, paranoid delusions. The powerful elite socialite network actively painted my legitimate corporate defense as a vicious, unprovoked physical assault on a beloved, prominent, elderly philanthropist. The immediate financial consequences were absolutely brutal and entirely undeniable. Our corporate stock price had already plummeted nearly 15% before the opening bell even rang. Major international investors were actively pulling their massive funding commitments, citing severe, sudden concerns regarding executive stability and basic leadership competency. The pristine, carefully curated reputation of Lewis Capital was actively hemorrhaging public trust at an utterly terrifying, completely unsustainable rate. The media assassination, however, represented only one distinct flank of their highly coordinated, aggressive counterattack. Aunt Beatrice sat rigidly to my immediate right, her usually immaculate navy suit looking slightly wrinkled from 2 consecutive, entirely sleepless nights of frantic legal maneuvering. She placed a thick, dense stack of freshly printed court documents onto the smooth glass surface, pushing them slowly toward the center of the table. The Sterling legal team just filed a massive emergency court injunction 20 minutes ago, she announced, her steady voice echoing sharply through the tense, quiet boardroom. They are officially claiming your public termination of the wedding caused severe, direct physical harm to Victoria. They are actively arguing that your verbal accusations constituted extreme malicious defamation, explicitly violating the strict non-disparagement clauses embedded deeply within the original prenuptial agreement. I turned away from the rain-slicked window, finally facing the terrified executive board members. What exactly is their specific legal objective? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat and entirely devoid of any readable human emotion. They are demanding total, immediate corporate receivership, Beatrice explained, her dark, intelligent eyes narrowing in profound disgust. They want a sympathetic federal judge to place your entire company under independent third-party management until the complex defamation lawsuit is fully resolved. They have successfully scheduled an emergency preliminary hearing for 3 o'clock this afternoon. If the presiding judge grants their temporary injunction, you will instantly lose total operational control of your own firm. The terrifying, stark reality of the impending legal disaster finally pushed the anxious board of directors completely over the edge. Marcus slammed his tablet face down onto the table, the sharp plastic clatter making several younger executives physically flinch. We cannot possibly survive a prolonged, highly publicized federal receivership battle, Delwyn, he stated, his deep voice trembling with genuine, profound anger. Our primary fiduciary duty is to protect the absolute financial integrity of this company and its shareholders. The major institutional banks are already threatening to severely restrict our operating credit lines by noon today. You have actively transformed yourself into an incredibly toxic, catastrophic liability. He paused, taking a deep, ragged breath before delivering the ultimate, devastating blow. We are convening an emergency formal voting session at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Marcus continued, his sharp gaze finally locking intensely onto mine. Unless you can miraculously produce absolute, irrefutable, undeniable physical evidence of their financial conspiracy before that court hearing begins, this board will officially vote to terminate your position as Chief Executive Officer. We will publicly sever all ties with you to immediately appease the terrified market and forcefully distance this firm from your personal disastrous scandal. A cold, heavy, numb sensation spread rapidly outward from the center of my chest, completely freezing the blood inside my veins. The very same brilliant people I had personally enriched and successfully guided through multiple, complex economic recessions were actively throwing me directly to the ravenous wolves. The brilliant, invincible empire I had sacrificed my entire youth to meticulously construct was suddenly turning its massive lethal weapons entirely against its own creator. I was standing entirely alone, completely isolated, upon the highest precarious peak of the corporate mountain. I had exactly less than 8 hours to completely dismantle an entrenched, powerful aristocratic dynasty and simultaneously save my own professional existence. The recorded audio file was clearly not enough. The wealthy, biased public easily dismissed the smartwatch recording as a clever digital fabrication or a totally misinterpreted private conversation. I needed something far more devastating, something incredibly tangible that the most skeptical federal judge could never possibly ignore. I looked down at the polished mahogany table, my brilliant analytical mind racing through every single microscopic detail of the chaotic weekend. I mentally replayed the intense confrontation inside the hotel suite, visualizing the exact positioning of Vanessa and the encrypted metal drive. Then I remembered the specific technical mechanism Vanessa had initially proposed to launder the stolen capital. She mentioned a pending escrow payment for a massive real estate acquisition located in Dubai. The Sterling family was completely broke, which meant they were utilizing external illicit funding to float that specific international transaction. I turned sharply toward Beatrice, my heart hammering a sudden, frantic new rhythm against my ribs. Did our forensic accounting team successfully freeze all domestic Sterling accounts? I asked urgently, my voice dropping into a low, highly focused register. Yes, Beatrice confirmed, looking slightly confused by my sudden, aggressive shift in strategy. Every single authorized domestic account is completely locked down tight. Then how exactly is Vanessa currently funding her urgent escape plan? I pressed the crucial realization blooming rapidly inside my mind. She demanded a $2 million bribe because she knew the domestic wells were completely dry. But she also explicitly mentioned managing their international holding companies. If the Sterlings are using an offshore shell company to actively launder illegal funds through a Dubai real estate escrow, they must have a physical secondary ledger, a hidden physical document detailing the exact routing numbers for their international wire fraud. Marcus scoffed loudly, folding his arms across his chest. A hidden ledger is a total mythical fantasy, Delwyn, he mocked openly. You are grasping blindly at absolute straws while our company literally burns to the ground. I completely ignored his profound, patronizing cowardice, leaning firmly over the table. I know exactly who possesses that hidden physical ledger, I declared, feeling the fierce returning fire of pure, unadulterated executive warfare burning brightly in my blood. Vanessa is the chief financial officer of their ruined estate. She absolutely kept a rigorous, meticulous backup record to secretly protect herself against her own treacherous mother and brother. I need to find my future sister-in-law immediately, before she boards an international flight and vanishes forever. The heavy boardroom doors suddenly swung open violently, interrupting my urgent tactical planning. My loyal executive assistant stood breathless in the wide doorway, her face completely pale with raw, absolute terror. She clutched a glowing tablet tightly against her chest, looking wildly around the room. "I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt you, Miss Lewis," she stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. But the situation just escalated dramatically. The federal police are currently in the main lobby downstairs. They possess a search warrant signed directly by a federal judge. They are demanding immediate access to your private servers regarding new explosive allegations of corporate espionage. The Sterling family had not merely filed a civil lawsuit. They had actively manipulated the criminal justice system to raid my corporate headquarters and forcefully confiscate the very servers holding my encrypted defensive assets. The final, definitive battle for total survival had officially arrived directly at my front door. The massive pendulum clock hanging high above the judge's bench struck exactly 3 in the afternoon. The sprawling Cook County courtroom was completely filled to absolute maximum capacity. Every single solid mahogany bench groaned beneath the combined physical weight of greedy corporate journalists, wealthy curious socialites, and aggressive legal associates. The stifling humid summer air inside the historic municipal building smelled faintly of stale floor wax and nervous perspiration. I sat rigidly straight beside my formidable lead counsel, staring directly ahead at the elevated wooden podium. The earlier terrifying confrontation involving federal authorities raiding my downtown corporate headquarters had been temporarily halted by this very emergency injunction hearing. The presiding magistrate, Honorable Judge Harrison, strictly demanded all involved parties present their comprehensive arguments immediately before authorizing any further invasive police actions. Preston sat proudly across the wide center aisle, flanked closely by 3 incredibly expensive, aggressive litigation specialists. He wore a slightly wrinkled charcoal suit, projecting the highly calculated false image of an exhausted, deeply traumatized victim. His lead representative, a slick, overly confident man named Harrison Vance, marched swiftly toward the center of the judicial chamber. He dramatically brandished a freshly printed copy of the exact digital document I had reluctantly authorized inside the luxurious bridal suite just 2 days prior. Your Honor, Vance began his booming, theatrical voice, echoing loudly off the polished stone walls. We humbly request total, immediate operational control over Lewis Capital. This legally binding power of attorney, explicitly signed by the defendant, clearly grants my client comprehensive executive authority. The defendant has demonstrated severe, dangerous mental instability, culminating in a vicious, unprovoked public assault that directly caused a near-fatal cardiac emergency for a beloved, prominent, elderly citizen. This firm requires independent, stable management instantly to prevent total, catastrophic market collapse and provide adequate financial restitution for the profound emotional damages inflicted upon the Sterling household. A low murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled quickly through the packed spectator gallery. The highly manipulative media narrative had successfully poisoned the public well. I felt the familiar, cold, icy grip of rising panic attempting to squeeze my lungs. But I simply turned my head slightly, observing the remarkably calm, steady profile of Aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was an incredibly powerful, highly respected African-American litigator who had spent 3 grueling decades systematically shattering every single racial and gender barrier erected within the elite Chicago judicial system. She grew up in a working-class neighborhood, strictly navigating a profoundly unequal society through sheer brilliant intellect and absolute relentless determination. While wealthy, privileged men like Preston were handed lucrative partnerships through nepotism, she had clawed her way to the prestigious pinnacle of corporate law by completely outsmarting, destroying, and publicly humiliating corrupt aristocratic dynasties. She absolutely despised entitled, fabricated power. She rose slowly from her leather chair, buttoning her immaculate tailored jacket with terrifying deliberate precision. She approached the heavy wooden podium, projecting an aura of immense, unyielding, absolute authority that instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. With all due respect to opposing counsel, she stated, her voice dropping into a lethal, perfectly modulated register. That entire emotional dramatic narrative is a complete, absolute, manufactured fiction. Beatrice calmly reached into her sleek professional briefcase, extracting a thin white manila envelope. She handed the sealed packet directly up to the surprised court clerk. "I submit into official public record the certified, unredacted medical evaluation completed by the attending emergency room physician at Northwestern Memorial Hospital just yesterday afternoon." Preston stiffened visibly in his seat, his sudden, sharp movement betraying a deep, underlying terror. Vance frowned deeply, stepping forward to quickly review the submitted paperwork. As the court can clearly verify, Beatrice continued pacing slowly across the smooth carpeted floor. Victoria Sterling did not suffer any form of cardiovascular event. Her heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen saturation levels were absolutely perfect. The attending cardiologist explicitly noted in his official diagnosis that her public collapse was a highly deliberate, voluntary physical performance, entirely mimicking hyperventilation. She was medically discharged less than 3 hours after her highly publicized, dramatic hospital admission. The entire medical crisis was a fraudulent, staged stunt designed specifically to weaponize public sympathy and actively manipulate this exact judicial proceeding. The heavy courtroom erupted into a chaotic, loud chorus of shocked gasps and frantic, furious whispers. The greedy journalists sitting in the back rows frantically typed the explosive new revelation into their glowing mobile devices. The presiding judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel forcefully against the acoustic sounding block, demanding immediate, strict order. Vance stammered, quickly attempting to rapidly salvage his crumbling foundation. "Even if the medical situation was slightly exaggerated, Your Honor, the signed contractual document remains entirely legally valid. The defendant willingly transferred absolute corporate authority to her designated spouse." Beatrice smiled. It was a cold, terrifying expression that lacked any genuine warmth or humor. "That brings me to my second point," she declared loudly, turning swiftly to stare directly into Preston's panicked, pale blue eyes. "The plaintiffs are aggressively claiming they require these vast corporate assets to secure their historical legacy and manage ongoing investments. However, a rigorous, comprehensive background financial investigation completed this morning reveals a truly fascinating hidden reality." She pulled a remarkably thick, heavy-bound ledger from her bag, slamming it forcefully onto the defense table. The loud cracking sound echoed like a sudden gunshot. "Preston Sterling is entirely, completely bankrupt," Beatrice announced, her powerful voice filling every single corner of the large room. "He does not possess a single liquid asset, trust fund, or valuable property. His personal banking accounts have maintained a negative balance for over 10 years. He is nothing more than a pathetic, heavily controlled pawn. His mother, Victoria, secretly orchestrated this entire elaborate, aggressive marital acquisition because their family estate is facing massive, insurmountable global debts. They did not want a merger. They desperately required an unwilling hostage to actively pay off their extensive international criminal obligations." The sheer, immense gravity of the horrific revelation completely crushed the remaining oxygen out of the packed chamber. Preston slumped heavily forward, burying his pale face completely into his shaking hands, publicly, completely shattered. His expensive lawyers exchanged rapid, terrified, nervous glances, realizing they had been deliberately lied to by their own desperate clients. But Beatrice was not quite finished dismantling their fraudulent empire. Furthermore, she added, raising her right hand high in the air, pointing a single manicured finger toward the digital document projected on the main evidence monitor. The specific authorization file the plaintiffs are utilizing to demand executive control contains a highly unique hidden metadata signature. The judge leaned far forward over his high bench, his heavy, bushy eyebrows knitting together in deep, intense curiosity. "Explain yourself, counselor," he commanded gruffly. "When my client authorized that digital transfer inside the hotel, she utilized a customized biometric coercion cipher." Beatrice explained brilliantly, detailing the precise trap I had laid. The specific fingerprint pressure signature embedded within that file automatically triggered an invisible distress protocol. Legally, operating under the established parameters of the Federal Electronic Signatures Act, this specific security mechanism explicitly designates the entire contract as signed under extreme malicious duress. Therefore, the document is fundamentally null, entirely void, and legally completely worthless. The ultimate final checkmate had been flawlessly executed. The undeniable, irrefutable combination of the faked medical emergency, the hidden severe bankruptcy, and the biometric digital trap completely annihilated their entire offensive strategy. The profound, heavy silence following her comprehensive presentation was incredibly absolute. Judge Harrison slowly removed his reading glasses, staring down at the defense table with absolute, pure, unfiltered disgust. This is without a doubt the most egregious malicious attempt to actively defraud this municipal court I have witnessed in my entire extensive career, he growled angrily, his deep voice shaking with genuine, righteous fury. The emergency injunction is immediately denied and completely dismissed with extreme, absolute prejudice. Furthermore, I am officially directing the state prosecutor's office to immediately open a comprehensive formal investigation into the Sterling estate regarding blatant perjury and severe systemic financial fraud. The loud final crack of the wooden gavel sounded exactly like a heavy tombstone sliding permanently into place. Preston let out a pathetic, quiet sob, entirely defeated. His lawyers quickly began packing their expensive leather briefcases, desperate to escape the toxic sinking ship. The massive legal threat against my lucrative company had been completely neutralized. I had successfully survived the brutal ambush and defended my hard-earned, independent empire. But mere basic survival was no longer sufficient. They had viciously attacked my character, maliciously manipulated the public press, and actively attempted to steal everything I loved. I could never allow them to simply retreat into the shadows and quietly rebuild their toxic, manipulative schemes. I placed my hands firmly flat against the solid, wooden surface of the defense table, pushing myself slowly upward until I was standing completely tall and perfectly straight. The chaotic room noticed my sudden, deliberate movement, and a fresh wave of breathless anticipation swept quickly through the crowded gallery. Beatrice looked at me, her dark eyes flashing with a profound, deep understanding. The defensive phase of this brutal war was officially, permanently over. Your Honor, I stated clearly, my voice ringing out with cold, lethal, absolute precision. I am incredibly grateful for your swift, decisive ruling today. However, before this official judicial session is formally adjourned, I have one final critical piece of physical evidence to formally submit. I reached deep into the hidden interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket, my fingers closing tightly around a small, metallic object. It was a single encrypted digital storage drive. I had specifically chosen not to simply survive their vicious attack. I was actively preparing to play my final, devastating, catastrophic card, guaranteeing the Sterling family could never possibly threaten anyone in this society ever again. The small metallic drive rested heavily in the palm of my right hand, capturing the bright fluorescent lights of the judicial chamber. I stepped away from the defense table, moving slowly toward the elevated bench where Judge Harrison observed my approach with deep, intense curiosity. The sprawling, crowded room remained completely frozen, suspended in a dense, thick layer of breathless anticipation. The wealthy spectators and aggressive journalists leaned forward collectively, desperate to witness the final, concluding stroke of this brutal corporate warfare. I placed the encrypted digital device gently onto the smooth wooden surface of the clerk station. This specific unit contains the complete unredacted routing histories for every single offshore shell corporation managed by the Sterling estate. I announced clearly, my voice echoing powerfully against the polished stone walls. Preston let out a strangled, pathetic gasp from the opposite side of the central aisle. His slick, expensive lawyer, Harrison Vance, jumped up rapidly, attempting to lodge a frantic, desperate objection. "You cannot possibly admit illegally obtained digital data into this proceeding," Vance shouted, his face flushing a bright, angry crimson. My Aunt Beatrice remained comfortably seated, radiating immense, calm satisfaction. "She did not hack their secure servers," Counselor Beatrice replied smoothly, her tone dripping with profound, icy condescension. "Your own arrogant clients willingly provided her with absolute, direct access." I turned fully to face the panicked, collapsing groom, looking directly into his terrified, pale eyes. "Your mother truly believed she could easily trap me, utilizing a simple, forged contractual addendum," I explained, keeping my delivery perfectly steady and lethal. "She arrogantly assumed my defensive digital security measures were designed solely to protect my existing corporate assets. But she profoundly underestimated my willingness to actively weaponize your own unbridled, catastrophic greed directly against you. When you legally filed that fraudulent power of attorney demanding total control over Lewis Capital, you inadvertently activated a reciprocal digital gateway." The quiet courtroom absorbed the complex technical explanation as the true, horrifying scope of my trap began to materialize. "By attempting to force my company under your umbrella, you unknowingly authorized my internal network to comprehensively audit your entire global financial portfolio." I continued, projecting my words to ensure every single seated journalist recorded the exact, precise details. "My enterprise servers operate under strict, continuous monitoring by the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission due to our massive institutional trading volume. The exact moment your legal team submitted that tainted document into the municipal court system, they unwittingly transferred your hidden, illegal, offshore ledgers directly into federal government jurisdiction." A profound, deafening silence blanketed the cavernous room as the mathematical reality of my statement crashed down upon the defense table. "Vanessa thought she was brilliantly laundering your remaining stolen capital through a fake real estate acquisition located in Dubai," I stated, watching the last remaining traces of hope completely drain from his face. "But the digital bridge your lawyers created automatically flagged those illicit international transfers as massive money laundering violations. You did not just fail to steal my independent company, Preston. You literally handed the federal government the exact, precise map required to completely annihilate your entire aristocratic bloodline." Right on cue, a synchronized chorus of vibrating mobile devices began to loudly buzz across the packed spectator gallery. The greedy reporters frantically checked their glowing screens, their eyes widening in absolute, unified shock. A prominent financial journalist sitting in the second row audibly gasped, breaking the heavy judicial silence. "The federal authorities just moved the reporter," whispered loudly to his colleague. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, alongside the Securities and Exchange Commission, executed a massive, coordinated global asset freeze exactly 20 minutes ago. Every single property, bank account, and international holding associated with the Sterling name has been officially seized under severe, sweeping racketeering charges. The judge banged his heavy wooden gavel, demanding order. But the sheer explosive magnitude of the revelation made maintaining quiet decorum entirely impossible. Preston violently collapsed forward onto his desk, weeping openly, without any remaining shred of manufactured dignity. He was no longer a wealthy, powerful socialite or a handsome, beloved community philanthropist. He was an utterly destitute, broken criminal facing decades inside a brutal, unforgiving federal penitentiary. His pristine childhood legacy had been completely, instantly vaporized by his own malicious, selfish actions. The defensive victory was complete, but the poetic justice was incredibly, flawlessly absolute. I had successfully liquidated my enemies using the exact, precise weapon they forged to destroy me. Exactly 6 long, transformative months later, the bitter, freezing winds of late November whipped fiercely off the dark, choppy surface of Lake Michigan. I stood quietly outside upon the expansive stone balcony of a sprawling, historic Gold Coast brownstone, pulling my heavy cashmere coat tightly around my shoulders. The crisp evening air smelled faintly of burning wood and distant, approaching snow, bringing a sharp, refreshing clarity to my busy mind. I held a crystal glass of expensive vintage bourbon, watching the vibrant city lights twinkle against the vast, endless darkness of the sweeping metropolitan skyline. This specific magnificent property once represented the absolute pinnacle of aristocratic exclusionary wealth. It was the ancestral Sterling family estate, the exact same massive, opulent home where Preston spent his entire privileged, arrogant childhood. Following their spectacular public downfall and subsequent federal indictments, the federal government rapidly auctioned off their seized real estate portfolio to compensate their countless defrauded victims. I did not simply walk away safely from the burning ashes of my ruined wedding. I actively purchased this enormous, valuable property for mere pennies on the dollar, acquiring the deed through an anonymous corporate shell entity. I spent the entire autumn season completely, mercilessly gutting the interior architecture. The dark, oppressive mahogany wood paneling, the terrifying, creepy oil portraits of old, wealthy ancestors, and the heavy, suffocating velvet drapes were all violently ripped out and immediately incinerated. I systematically replaced the old, decaying history with soaring, modern glass walls, sleek, imported steel beams, and brilliant, bright, open-concept spaces. The towering, multi-level structure was no longer a toxic monument to inherited, unearned privilege and dark, hidden, familial betrayal. I had successfully transformed the conquered territory into the new, permanent, exclusive executive retreat for the senior leadership team of Lewis Capital. It now stood as a massive, glowing fortress dedicated entirely to modern, brilliant innovation, relentless hard work, and the undeniable immense power of self-reliance. I heard the smooth, quiet sliding of the heavy glass terrace door opening behind me. Aunt Beatrice stepped outside onto the chilly balcony, holding her own crystal tumbler of rich, dark liquor. She wore a comfortable, elegant wool sweater, completely relaxed after another highly successful, incredibly profitable quarter for our thriving legal division. She walked gracefully toward the carved stone railing, standing closely beside me as we both gazed outward over the prosperous, bustling city below. The appellate courts officially denied the final, desperate bail application submitted by Victoria this morning. Beatrice announced, her warm, deep voice carrying effortlessly over the howling winter wind. She will officially remain incarcerated inside the maximum security facility awaiting her formal criminal trial next spring. And Vanessa successfully secured a terrible plea agreement that guarantees she will serve at least 15 long, miserable years inside a federal prison camp. They are completely, permanently neutralized, Delwyn. The entire hostile board of directors who threatened to terminate you during the crisis have all been systematically replaced by brilliant, loyal visionaries who genuinely respect your incredible tactical genius. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the smooth, burning bourbon, letting the complex, rich flavors wash over my tongue. The journey had been incredibly agonizing, filled with sharp, unexpected betrayals and terrifying steep cliffs. I had been forced to wage a brutal, unyielding psychological war against the very person I falsely believed would become my lifelong, loving partner. But peering down at the bustling, prosperous streets from the towering balcony of my newly conquered estate, I felt absolutely zero lingering regret. I had confronted the darkest, ugliest depths of human greed and emerged completely, fundamentally victorious. We built something truly magnificent here, Beatrice, I replied softly, turning to look at the powerful, brilliant woman who had steadfastly guided me through the terrifying, chaotic storm. We did not just survive a catastrophic corporate assassination attempt. We successfully rewrote the entire fundamental landscape of this society. They demanded I sacrifice my entire independent empire upon the ancient, archaic altar of traditional matrimonial obedience. Instead, I forcefully claimed their entire historical kingdom and built my own brilliant, beautiful future directly on top of their shattered ruins. Beatrice smiled warmly, raising her heavy glass in a quiet, respectful toast to our shared, immense triumphs. To choosing yourself, she declared softly, the simple phrase carrying the heavy, profound weight of 1,000 hard-fought victories. To choosing myself, I echoed, firmly tapping my crystal rim gently against hers. The sharp musical ring resonated beautifully into the cold, deep Chicago night, marking the absolute perfect, astonishing conclusion to a masterclass in ultimate revenge. The tragic, heartbreaking family drama had completely evaporated, leaving behind a stunning, awe-inspiring testament to feminine power and unyielding corporate dominance. The audience of my life, the critics, the investors, and the high society gossips were left completely, utterly astonished, permanently silenced by the sheer, undeniable magnitude of my total, complete triumph. The architecture of legacy. What the sterling ruin teaches us about blood and betrayal. The glittering, commanding skyline of Chicago, viewed from the newly renovated, soaring balconies of Lewis Capitol, tells a magnificent story of hard-won triumph. But beneath the polished steel, the imported marble, and the flawless, soundproof glass lies a much darker, quieter truth about the fragile foundations of human legacy. When the Sterling Empire collapsed in a spectacular, profoundly public implosion, the financial world witnessed a masterful, ruthless execution of corporate defense. Yet for those who choose to look closely at the shattered, smoking remnants of that aristocratic dynasty, the true tragedy was not written in stolen international ledgers, forensic accounting reports, or fraudulent offshore accounts. The fatal, inescapable flaw of the Sterling family was entirely domestic. It was a staggering, generation-spanning failure of parenting values and family responsibility. The hollow core of inherited privilege. When federal authorities systematically dismantled the Sterling estate, freezing assets and seizing ancestral homes, they did not just confiscate bank accounts and physical properties. They laid bare the profound emotional bankruptcy of a mother who fundamentally misunderstood the sacred assignment of parenthood. Victoria Sterling constructed a magnificent, impenetrable fortress of generational wealth, utilizing every social connection and financial loophole available. But in her ruthless pursuit of external validation, she entirely forgot to build a moral spine within the very children meant to inherit her kingdom. In modern American society, we often tragically confuse providing for our children with protecting them from reality. Victoria shielded Preston from every single consequence of his chronic incompetence. She handed him elevated titles he did not earn, buried the catastrophic mistakes he routinely made, and aggressively attacked anyone who dared to question his merit. In doing so, she robbed him of the single most crucial element of long-term parental guidance, the vital opportunity to fail, to feel the sharp sting of inadequacy, and to subsequently develop genuine, earned self-reliance. Instead of raising a capable leader, she cultivated a beautiful, hollow mannequin, a man who looked the part of a powerful executive, but lacked the internal structural integrity to withstand even the slightest breeze of true adversity. The illusion of the traditional family. True traditional family structures are not anchored by the sheer volume of their accumulated bank accounts, nor by the pristine, curated images they meticulously project at charity galas. They are anchored by a rigid, uncompromising adherence to honesty, fairness, and deep emotional awareness. A parent's ultimate responsibility is not to engineer a frictionless paved path for their offspring. It is to equip them with the necessary internal armor to navigate a profoundly unforgiving, fiercely competitive world. By actively encouraging deceit, by teaching Preston to manipulate a brilliant, capable woman for her equity, and by conditioning Vanessa to skim aggressively from the family coffers just to survive her own mother's suffocating tyranny, Victoria planted the exact toxic seeds of her family's total destruction. The betrayal was internal, festering in their grand hallways long before it ever became a matter of public record. The sibling betrayal. Vanessa eagerly sold out her family's final escape route for a $2 million bribe. This was the direct, logical result of being raised in an environment where parental love was highly conditional, loyalty was purely transactional, and siblings were deliberately groomed to vie for power rather than support one another. The mother's blindness, Victoria, continuously discriminated against her own daughter's intelligence while rewarding her son's blind obedience, creating a deep, festering resentment that ultimately severed their bloodline. They did not fall because Delwyn was a monster. They fell because the Sterlings had been actively rotting from the inside out for decades. The anchor of genuine family responsibility. Contrast this profound moral decay with the quiet, unyielding strength of Aunt Beatrice. As an African-American woman who expertly navigated the ruthless, white male-dominated corridors of corporate law without the safety net of inherited privilege or social pedigree, Beatrice provided the exact type of maternal guidance that Delwyn desperately required. Beatrice did not offer empty, soothing platitudes or blind, coddling protection. Instead, she consistently offered the harsh, illuminating light of objective reality. Beatrice did not sugarcoat the brutality of the corporate or social arenas. She prepared Delwyn for the reality that the world will not naturally accommodate your weaknesses. It will exploit them. Strategic vision. She demanded absolute emotional awareness, urging Delwyn to clearly see the strategic chessboard rather than drowning aimlessly in the terrible heartbreak of romantic betrayal. Ethical fortitude. She embodied the absolute essence of long-term guidance teaching that true survival and lasting success are strictly contingent upon facing uncomfortable, ugly truths with clear eyes and an uncompromising demand for ethical fairness. Beatrice understood that true family responsibility sometimes means letting the raging fire burn away the dead, toxic wood so that new, robust, healthy growth can finally take root. She was the steady, unwavering compass in a sea of aristocratic deception, proving that family is ultimately defined by the core values you share and the unvarnished truths you uphold, not merely by the blood running in your veins. Cultivating emotional awareness in the next generation. We see this crucial dynamic reflected constantly across the shifting, complex landscape of American culture. The dynasties and families that truly endure over generations are not the ones who hide their fatal flaws behind heavy velvet drapes, aggressive non-disparagement clauses, and expensive public relations teams. They are the families who possess the courage to sit at the dinner table and speak the unvarnished truth, even when that truth temporarily shatters a comfortable, pleasant illusion. In a society that increasingly values rapid, superficial achievement, the arduous, invisible work of instilling emotional awareness is often entirely neglected. We mistakenly believe that if our children are completely comfortable, they are secure. But true security is strictly internal. It is the quiet, unbreakable confidence that one can endure failure, betrayal, and monumental loss and still perfectly retain their fundamental sense of self. Raising a child requires the profound, heartbreaking courage to allow them to experience the painful, isolating sting of their own bad decisions. Had Preston been held strictly accountable for his very first minor financial transgression or personal failure decades ago, he might have eventually developed the necessary psychological resilience to build his own authentic life. Instead, a lifetime of aggressive maternal coddling and constant excuse-making transformed him into a parasitic entity entirely dependent on the systematic theft of others to sustain his unearned social status. When parents prioritize the appearance of success over the grueling reality of emotional and moral development, they do not create a lasting legacy. They create a beautifully decorated time bomb. Join the narrative. If you find yourself utterly captivated by these deep psychological explorations of family breakdown, inheritance disputes, and the profound rippling consequences of betrayal, make sure to subscribe and follow the Linda Vengeance channel. We consistently dive deep into the intricate architecture of human motivation, unraveling the complex, gripping narratives of those who build magnificent empires and those who foolishly burn them to the ground. Join our growing community for more intense, serialized drama that powerfully mirrors the darkest and most triumphant aspects of the modern human experience. The final reflection. As the deafening noise surrounding the Sterling collapse finally fades into a quiet, forgotten whisper, and the pristine glass doors of Lewis Capitol slide firmly shut against the freezing Chicago wind, we are left entirely alone to look at our own reflections. The grandest, most terrifying tragedy of Victoria Sterling is that she truly, genuinely believed she was acting out of fierce, devoted maternal love. She was completely, utterly blind to the reality that she was meticulously, painstakingly crafting her own children's permanent execution. It forces a quiet, deeply unsettling question to the surface of our minds as we sit across the table from our own loved ones. When we hastily smooth the difficult path for them, when we quietly fix their messes behind the scenes, and when we desperately hide their flaws from the judging, critical eyes of the world, are we actually saving them? Or are we just building a more beautiful, towering cliff for them to inevitably fall from?